Hi, welcome back to the second panel of our Schiller Institute Vernadsky Conference. This panel will be called Physical Economy Developing the Noösphere. And we've just heard some very powerful and timely ideas concerning Vernadsky, the Noösphere, and LaRouche's economics from a uniquely interrelated standpoint. And we saw that seemingly separate entities can be shown to be connected by processes of action, demonstrable empirically, as Vernadsky showed. He showed that mankind is an integral part of the universe and extends the development of the universe. LaRouche, in his policy thesis, 4 New Laws to Save the USA Now, agreed that this is the fundamental principle of science and economics. He said, V.I. Vernadsky's systemic principle of human nature is a universal principle which is uniquely specific to the crucial factor of the existence of the human species. We call it chemistry. Mankind's progress, as measured rather simply as a species, is expressed typically in the rising power of the principle of human life over the abilities of animal life generally, and relatively absolute superiority over the powers of non-living processes to achieve within mankind's willful intervention to that intended effect. Progress exists so only under a continuing progressive increase of the productive and related powers of the human species. That progress defines the absolute distinction of the human species from all others presently known to us. A government of people based on a policy of zero population growth and per capita standard of human life is a moral and practical abomination. Man is mankind's only true measure of the history of our solar system and what reposes within it. That is the same thing as the most honored meaning and endless achievement of the human species now within nearby solar space, heading upward to mastery over the sun and its solar system, the one discovered uniquely, as a matter of fact, by Johannes Kepler. A fusion economy is the presently urgent next step and standard for man's gains of power within the solar system and later beyond. We're going to get into these topics, all of these mentioned above, mastery over the biosphere, mastery of the economy, and space and fusion in our discussion period coming up now. I just wanted to mention quickly Vernadsky's political role. We've discussed a lot of his scientific ideas and touched on some of his political work, but I just want to emphasize that he always saw his role as a citizen in general and science as part of that mission, part of that identity. In college, he was a member of the St. Petersburg Committee of Literacy, which drew up reading programs for adult education, started lending libraries, worked on educating newly literate around higher concepts. He was elected president of the United Council of Student Organizations. In 1891, when there was a famine, one of the worst famines in Russia in the 1800s, he organized relief for the community where his estate was, working with friends to establish 121 relief kitchens and feed more than 6,000 people. He was then elected to the Zemstvo, the form of local government in Russia, which was newly established, and worked within that framework to make changes, political and economic changes, such as through the education system. He worked to establish a hospital, establish newspapers, and he even filed a lawsuit at one point against a leading advisor to the Tsar, Pobednetsev, who objected to his policy of secular Sunday schools, and Vernadsky won that case. And he was also a member of the higher parliament in Russia for 5 years. He was a founding member of the Cadet Party, the Constitutional Democratic Party, in 1905. which won 40% of the seats in the first election, and Vernadsky worked to establish the economic policy of the party. As mentioned earlier, he also was very strong in organizing discovery of radioactive ores and radioactivity and radioactive science in general, with the newly developing atomic science being very exciting, not just for war purposes, as some say about Vernadsky now, but for the peaceful use of atomic science. He also worked to establish the Commission for the Study of Natural Productive Forces of Russia to find resources, platinum, titanium, bauxites, and to establish new sciences such as ceramics, optics, radium, chemical analysis, soil, geography, and to establish a biochemical laboratory. He was also made the Assistant Minister of Education at one point, being in charge of all the universities and scientific institutions in Russia. And one diary entry from his student years, I think, shows his opinion of the role of a scientist, the duty of a scientist. He says that one of his friends had argued that the scientist by his work alone brings value to society and therefore does not need to know, must even forget about the society he is helping. Vernadsky said, "I hold a completely different opinion. The task of a person is to achieve the most good for those around him. Placing as a goal the development of mankind, we see that this is achieved by a variety of means, and one of these is science." So for Vernadsky, the biosphere and noosphere, the role of mankind in these was not a separate entity, but the noosphere was a necessary component of science. So in that discussion of political economics, we have some very interesting speakers today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Farouk Elbaz, who will be speaking on the development corridor for Egypt and North Africa. Professor Elbaz is an Egyptian American scientist who worked with NASA in planning the exploration of the moon during the Apollo missions. He is currently the director of the Center for Remote Sensing at Boston University and has an asteroid named after him in recognition of his outstanding scientific achievements. And he has worked on utilizing satellite imaging for groundwater discoveries. So, Mr. Elbaz.
Thank you very much. I would like first to thank both Rochelle and David for all their help, which made everything very easy for me. And I'm delighted to address you today because of the importance of talking about science as it applies to human beings, as it applies to the people that live at that time. And I began to look at the Western Desert in Egypt by order from or request by President Anwar Sadat. He called me in and he said, the population of Egypt is surrounding the Nile Valley and we are going to live on top of each other. I would like to think about Egypt to put 2 million in Sinai and 3 million in the Eastern Desert and 4 or 5 million in the Western Desert. And we don't know how to do that. You're the man that has been studying deserts in India and China and everywhere. You tell me where to put these numbers of people in the desert of Egypt, because we've got to get away from the Nile, otherwise we'll kind of suffocate the Nile. And he was right. President Sadat had the vision, and he certainly was right about the fact that people cannot live on top of each other like that in a very small area of the land. I'll give you an example of this. If David would show me the colorful slide. Yeah, there's one here. You can see the gray batch, and this is the first part of the Nile Delta, the southernmost part of the Nile Delta. At the very bottom, you can see the Nile River with its boundary of cultivated land, which is all the red is cultivated land. It's the chlorophyll in the plant itself is the one that gives us this red in the multispectral image. And the gray batch in the middle of the picture is the city of Cairo. All of the yellow around it is the growth of that city in 10 years. So the city is growing like an amoeba, consistently growing over agricultural land. Look at the 10-year growth, all of this yellow color in 10 years. So what in 100 years, where would it be? If 10 years, every 10 years, it will grow apart like that. So I began to think that it is impossible to think about Egypt living in the same place like that, especially now where the population of Egypt has reached 104 billion people. This is a vast number of people on top, living on top of each other. And not just on top of each other, they are building living quarters over agricultural land, which means that they no longer can produce the food they require. For instance, right now, Egypt is now in the bottom of the pit because they used to import wheat and other grain from Ukraine. And Ukraine can no longer send wheat or sell things abroad. And the seas around Ukraine is also are party of the Russian advancement. So there is no wheat to be given to much of the population in Egypt. So it is a disaster, really, which means that people should think about what is it that we can do to utilize more of our land for living, rather than living on top of each other within the Nile Valley like that. This is when I began to thought that maybe, okay, well, maybe we can go into the desert. I began looking at in the desert areas with satellite images, and we found water here and there and groundwater, so that we thought maybe some people can come in here. But no one in Egypt would think about living away from the Nile. Actually, in one time, I was in an oasis doing field work, and one of the people that we used to hire to help us in the field, to set up the tents or anything like that in the field, he came to tell me, I can't go with you tomorrow. I said, why? He said, because I have to, tomorrow we have to, my younger brother died and we have to bury him tomorrow. I said, so we can wait for you to bury and then we'll go. He said, no, we can't bury him. We'll have to bury him in Gift. I said, Gift? I knew that Gift is a town or a village along the Nile. And we are in the middle of the desert, in the Kharga oasis, way away from the Nile, 400 miles away from the Nile. So I thought, you're going to take the kid, your brother that died, you'll take his remains to bury next to the river? He said, yes. I said, why? He said, well, Gift is our city, my sir. This is not our place. Our place is by the Nile. So even after death, they still consider they have to bury their dead right by the Nile, not where they were living in the middle of the desert, in the oases. So I thought people are not going to move away from the Nile at all to live, as President Sadat thought that he would be able to move people all over the place, and millions and millions would live away from the Nile. So I thought, at least let us allow them to build things and factories and whatever the hell they want to do, universities and schools and hospitals, all of the world, away from the agricultural land, so they can save the agricultural land for food production. So this is when I thought, okay, then we have to move their thinking a little far away from the fertile land of the dirt. Nice. Next. So I thought, David, the slide. So I thought of something which I call the development corridor. If we have from each and every big town in Egypt a line or a corridor, a road going west towards the Western Desert, because the Western Desert is the only nice flat place in Egypt. The Eastern Desert is full of mountains. You cannot really develop in it. But the Western Desert is flat, and you can move westward with it. The darker area just southwest of the green Nile Delta is the former delta of the Nile. The area that you can see like a delta shape and right next to the river there is the former delta. It's okay. So there is we have this is the delta now, and there is the former delta right here. So southwest of the present delta. And I thought if we have from the town of Tanta, from Cairo, from Fayoum, from Minya, from all of these major towns along the Nile River, if we have roads to go out this way, and we would connect them with the main highway going from El Alamein, west of the Delta, west of Alexandria, all the way going to the south like that, parallel to the Nile, but giving us space area right here, I would think that all of this area west of the lived area in Egypt would be developed, whether some of it for agriculture, some of it maybe industry, some of it maybe the universities will build there, some of it maybe hospitals and whatnot. So the development can be extended. Now, by how much? Actually, the area where all of Egyptians live today, all of the towns and villages and factories and whatever it is 7.5 million cubic kilometers. But the area that I expanded by moving this by this black line, which is the development corridor, that expands the area by 1.5 times, because this area here that expanded is 10.5 million kilometers. So it is just doubles and half the amount of living area in Egypt, and that's the only way we're doing it. Next, David. Yeah, here it is, because you can do that from, if you think of the Nile River on the right side, you have an east-west connector like this, and this is a superhighway, but you could also have a railroad and the electric station and the pipeline, water pipeline, to allow the area between this line and the Nile Delta, which can be 20 kilometers or 40 kilometers or even 10 is fine, 5 kilometers fine, can be developed by building towns and villages and hospitals and universities and whatever it is. That's why I thought that the development corridor could increase the land area of Egypt. The land area of Egypt now that's utilized completely is 7.5 million cubic meters. The area that the development corridor would extend is comes to 10.5 million cubic meters, meaning 1.5 in addition to the existing area now in Egypt. Next. So that's the white area here that it opens up all the lines. That's the red, and the red areas are deposits of the former Nile. So this all the red spaces here are actually Nile deposits, but all the white is absolutely flat regions that could be utilized in agriculture, industry, in building, all kinds of things, both in the north and way down in the south near the Aswan Dam and the Lake Nasser. So there are lots of areas that are flat and with good soil that can be expanded for food production. Next. Because of this, I thought that if we can do that, that line actually should be extended throughout, all the way through Sudan and all the way in Africa to connect to Cape Town in South Africa, because there is really no easy way from Europe to Africa, or from the east, from India and so on to back to the northern part of Africa. So if we do this in Egypt and extend it all the way to East Africa, it can be the connection between all of Africa, all of East Africa at least, to Europe, and a gateway from all of Europe to anywhere in Africa if we have ease of transportation by this development corridor. So I talked about that corridor in Egypt a great deal, and the actually President Sisi of Egypt, who's now president of Egypt, called me in before he became president, and he told me straight out that I have put the development corridor in my election campaign and in my plan for Egypt in when I become president, the corridor is in there. But up till now, nothing very much has been done. So it is. I really think it is something that should be given great attention, not just for sake of Egypt now, but for sake of East Africa in the future. It is a way to limit the people taking over agricultural land and moving their structures and industry and buildings and cities and so on away from agricultural land, because it is the only source for their food. Because right now the Egyptians are in a deep mess because of the food that they imported from Ukraine. So there is no sweet peace without being able to eat. So that, as far as I'm concerned, the development corridor is the only way out for all of Egypt, and maybe the only way out for all of East Africa to live nicely and to be able to communicate with the West and have a space for their industries and everything else, leaving agricultural land for food production. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elbaz. I think that'll go right into some of our following presentations, and we'll have a general discussion and question and answer session after that. So our next presentation will be on the Transaqua project from engineer Andrea Mangano. He is a veteran of the Bonifica engineering team that developed the original Transaqua concept in the 1970s.
Good morning, everybody. I will try to present an idea that I've been elaborating since many years together with my colleague and friend Marcello Vitti, when working together in Africa in the last decades of the last century, so many years ago. As you know, Lake Chad is situated in the Sahel region at the border between Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. And it is suffering a great crisis for the climate change and the increase of population. Next slide, please. It has an enormous apparent watershed of almost 3 million square kilometers, but the effective area is about 1 million that receives effectively rainfall. Nowadays, about 50 million people are estimated to live there. Next. You can see here the details of the basin. Next. The basin has been subject, as these images from the NASA show, an enormous reduction in the surface of the lake. Go ahead. We have to note that these images are a little bit misleading on scientific terms, but in any case, we can see that the surface of the lake, in average, annually, has decreased from about 25,000 square kilometers to more or less 7,500 in the last years, with a population that has increased from 8 to 50 million. Next. It is not the case now to discuss what are the causes of this enormous reduction. If it is the climate change, if it is the population, or what else. The point is that when Lake Chad is an endorheic lake, which means that it has no outlet to the sea. So any changement in its dimension is exactly reflecting the changing in the equilibrium between rainfall and evaporation or consumption of water. So we have seen other examples in the past of similar cases occurring all around the world. The most famous is that of Lake Aral, that has been completely dried out in the 50s and 40s of the last centuries because warm water was used to increase irrigation of cotton cultivation. Next. Another recent case is that of Lake Urmia in Iran, which is also drying. You can see how much the surface has decreased in the last decades. Lake Turkana is a big issue these days because a series of dams have been constructed on its tributary, the Omo, and it is likely that this will affect the equilibrium of Lake Turkana, which is considered the cradle of the humankind. The famous human ancestor Lucy came from the shores of Lake Turkana. Next. Another case, a very famous one, is that of the Dead Sea, which is in effect a lake, an endorheic lake, and the overexploitation of water is being causing the drying of the lake, so that there are projects ongoing for refilling it, taking water from the Red Sea. Now, why do you want to save endorheic lake? We don't want to save it. Next, please. The lakes, we are willing to, we think that we have to protect the human beings together with the environment where they live. In effect, a shrinking closed lake is just the symptom of the fact that there is a lack of equilibrium between water resources and consumption. So the idea came of having a transfer of water to this area from surrounding areas where there is an enormous surplus of water resources. And the source of this water could be the enormous water basin of the Congo River that has an average discharge of 42,000 cubic meters per second, which means 1,300 billion cubic meters per year. The idea is that of constructing a series of structures capable of diverting water from the lake, from the Congo River to the Lake Chad, in order to increase irrigated agriculture, restore the lake for fishing and environmental protection, produce hydropower, and improve transport in the African Central region. And the idea is that of constructing a series of dams intercepting the tributaries of the Congo and conveying them toward the water divide between the two basins and divert water finally into Lake Chad. How much water can be diverted is exactly the scope of a feasibility study that has to be carried out. A very preliminary estimates says that this amount could be so much as 100 billion cubic meters per year. But this is a very preliminary estimate. When dams intercepting the rivers are constructed, hydropower production could be realized, and also a series of canals could be constructed, thus permitting internal navigation within the area. Now, in relatively recent years, the Lake Chad Basin Commission, which is the regional authority for the management of the lake basin, has committed a study to a Canadian engineering firm that showed that, next please, there is a precise location at the water divide between Congo Basin and Chad Basin where a diversion can be made by gravity without any pumping, any mechanical device, simply constructing a dam and capable of diverting water to the other side of the watershed. This slide shows more or less the series of dams that would intercept the tributaries of the Ubangi River, which is at its turn the main right side tributary of the Congo River, in the territory of the Central African Republic. And this could constitute a first stretch of the whole Transaqua idea, capable of diverting up to 20-25 billion cubic meters per year of water toward Chad. This idea has, for a long time, considered something pharaonic, something exaggerated, that was not affordable by the international community. The point is that in these decades, the population, as I showed earlier, enormously increased. The climate change has aggravated the crisis of the lake, and that we are today in the condition of facing an enormous crisis regarding about 50 million people in the area. This has brought the Lake Chad Basin Commission in February 2018 to conclude that the interbasin water transfer is no longer an option but a necessity. And a pledge was made during this conference in 2018 by the Italian government for the financing of feasibility study of this idea, but unfortunately the project has not been implemented so far.
Right. Thank you for that. We will have a discussion on that later. Our next presentation will be from Michael Palushik, president of Princeton Satellite Systems. He will be discussing latest developments in nuclear fusion and a particular fusion experiment which can be utilized for propulsion in space, including for an expedition to Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, which has a dense atmosphere and standing bodies of liquid.
Today I'm going to talk about direct fusion drive and also describe a visit eater I made a couple of months ago. This is the PFRC-2 experiment at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab. The work has been funded by NASA through the NIAC program, ARPA-E, and the Department of Energy. And what we're doing is we're studying the plasma physics for an experiment. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about its application to a Titan aircraft reactor. So the field reverse configuration is also known as FRC, is a type of magnetic geometry. It's a little bit different from a tokamak, a mirror, or a stellarator, although it actually is very similar to a mirror in many ways. This particular geometry is being used by the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab for the PFRC experiment, but it's also used by Helium for their proposed deuterium helium-3 machines, which are the two fuels they plan to use, and TAE for boron-proton machines. Both organizations have gotten really promising results, and they're using different approaches, but the geometry is the same. The PFRC, which is our approach, is suitable for much smaller machines that are contemplated by other organizations. Just to give you some ideas of the advantages of an FRC over a tokamak stellarator, the three configurations are shown to the right, and the major advantage is an FRC is quite simple, but also it allows for very high ratio of plasma pressure versus magnetic field pressure. So the higher that is, the closer it is to 1, the more plasma you can confine in a given area, and the lower your magnetic fields need to be. So this is a simple, small, and clean microreactor. One of the reasons it's small is the nature of the heating system, rotating magnetic fields, which use radio frequency waves to heat the plasma. And also it's small to allow the products of the reaction to leave. We have side reactions, which are deuterium, which do produce tritium. And if the tritium fuses with deuterium, you get really high energy neutrons. So you want to avoid that. And if we can avoid that, then we have much less neutron damage than you would have with the DT machine. So we've looked at this in quite a lot of detail. Here are all the subsystems that go into an operating machine. There's the fuel tanks to the left, and there are actually two types of fuel in our machine. One is the actual reactants, which produce fusion, but the other one is a flow of ionized gas that flows around the FRC, and this sweeps away the products of the reaction. And this is much lower temperature than the products of the fusion reaction themselves. We also have superconducting coil, low temperature are fine for our application, although the mirrors, as I mentioned earlier, this has some relationship to mirrors. We do have mirror coils, and those might be a hybrid magnet with a little bit of high temperature tape in them, but not all high temperature tape. And then we have to cool the magnets. We also have to have a system for converting waste heat, and that comes from X-rays, because our machine is such high temperature we get a lot of X-rays, and also some synchrotron radiation. Both of these are waste products of the reaction and need to be thermalized and converted into energy, which is then used to drive the machine. I should note that the products of our fusion reactions do not heat the plasma, so it's entirely a driven machine. This is different from, say, a tokamak like ITER or D3D or other machines, where the goal would be for the tokamak products themselves, the products of the fusion reaction, to self-heat the plasma. So why is it good for space? Well, we give a lot of explanation here, but it's the deuterium helium-3 reaction does require higher temperature. So we say, well, DT has a lot of advantages in that regard. But the higher temperatures have been achieved in machines. The tokamak fusion test reactor, which was here at Plasma Physics Lab, reached temperatures of 40 kiloelectron volts. So by the way, we use electron volts instead of degrees Kelvin, just because the numbers are smaller and easier to handle. The other thing is that we have a direct thrust mechanism. This is important because if you were to take the output, then convert them to electricity through any means, and then use that to, say, drive an electric thruster, you end up with a very heavy system. And one of the key parameters in propulsion is what we call specific power. In other words, how much power do you get per kilogram of reactor? And that kilogram of reactor includes everything: radiators, structure, everything associated with your fusion reactor. You can't just include just the power generation part to give a realistic, useful number. So that's one of the advantages. And if you look down below, we show that nuclear electric propulsion, which is converting the power to electricity, you get 0.02 kilowatts per kilogram. Solar actually isn't bad at 0.1 kilowatts per kilogram, but with direct fusion drive, we might get as high as 2. And on the left side, you see the beta. This gives you the idea how big the machine has to be for a given amount of power. And you can see the beta of an FRC is much higher than almost any other technology. Now, another thing that's interesting about deuterium tritium is you do have to breed the tritium. For a terrestrial reactor, that would be done with a big lithium blanket, which is also needed for neutron shielding around the machine. For space, you would store the tritium on board your spacecraft. So again, the natural thrust mechanism is we're flowing this, what we call the propellant, which flows around the area where fusion's happening, so it doesn't mix in the region where the fusion is occurring. And that is heated by the products, which produces thrust. And this allows us to get variable thrust, so we can change the exhaust velocity and the thrust itself within limits interchangeably, which is very helpful for many missions. We've had a lot of support from many organizations. It started with the magnetic nozzle experiment, and that's a DoD funded. PFRC 1 and 2 were also funded by the Department of Energy through plasma physics funding. We then had a NIAC project, which was to look at system study and also to support some of the experiments from NASA. This was followed by some STTRs. That's a NASA small business grant, which is designed to allow small businesses to work with universities. And that allowed us to actually acquire a low temperature coil to study the effect, low temperature superconducting coil, I should say, to study the effect of plasma transients, because plasma is never going to be perfectly steady, and you want to make sure that any currents you induce in the superconducting coils don't cause it to quench or lose its superconductivity. This was followed by an ARPA-E open grant, which has been used to study the plasma, and we're getting very close to our ion heating experiments. Not quite there. This is also followed by an experiment to build a new diagnostic, which we're going to be used to measure the ion temperatures in our machine. And this was followed by Gamma, where we're developing power electronics for the entire fusion industry. And this includes heating and control, diagnostics, and everything you can imagine. So the latest results are we're getting higher densities. We've gotten our frequency down to 2 megahertz, which is at the sort of the maximum frequency we would like for heating ions. The higher the frequency, the more you tend to heat electrons instead of ions. So this is pretty good. It's not ideal, but it's getting close to that. And we expect to see some good ion heating in the next couple of months. We've set up all the electronics. It's not a trivial process. We have amplifiers which produce at 2 megahertz, but then we have to connect them via transmission lines, and then additional circuits which match the transmission lines to the antennas. So it's a very complicated electrical engineering problem. But all this stuff is going on. We have our new diagnostic built, and it's going to be hooked into the experiment shortly. And we've calibrated it, and it looks really good. So now we're going to talk a little bit about an interesting mission. The idea would be you would have a spacecraft, which would have a direct fusion drive, a fusion engine, which would be used to propel the spacecraft and take it to orbit around Titan. It would not need to do any flybys of any other bodies to gain speed. It would just power its way there, accelerate, then decelerate. And it would enter first the orbit of Saturn, and then it would enter the orbit of Titan. Once it does that, it would release the aircraft on the right. Now you'll see it in the configuration. It would be at low speed. At high speed, all those ducted fans would be covered with shrouds. The entry actually is entirely using lift and drag. You don't have to use any kind of propulsion, which is why we went with propellers, because once we get the subsonic speeds, we want to use propellers. You really can't use jets on the Titan, because you'll melt. Every time you land, you would melt everything. So this is the aircraft, and we use NASA aircraft design code for it, and this shows you some of the computational fluid dynamics. And we would operate at subsonic, maybe up to 0.85, but the idea would be that with this fusion reactor, it could operate for years and visit every single part of the moon, and that would be really exciting. A Dragonfly is going to Titan soon, but it's only going to be able to test a really small part of Titan, really look at Titan, a tiny area, and it only has about 70 watts of power. This would have almost a megawatt of power. You could power drills and things like that. This shows the aircraft reactor. To the left of the pie pie chart showing the mass of all the components. And if you look very closely, we think we can get 1.2 megawatts out of a 1,400 kilogram engine, which is pretty good. And that includes radiators and things like that. On the right is a power flow diagram showing that, all the numbers really do add up. So I'm also going to talk about a visit to ITER, which I did. And this was part of going to the International Astronautical Congress in Paris. And we went down, we took the TGV down to Aix-en-Provence, and we visited ITER. It was really interesting. And it's the largest fusion experiment in the world. It's being built right now. They hope to get first plasma in maybe 5 years. And then they hope to do burning plasma experiment, where you mix deuterium and tritium in the reactor in the mid-2030s. And that'll be an experiment where you burn the plasma long enough to study the behavior of the system when the plasma is burning, which is a challenge. JET has also burned plasma, as did the tokamak fusion test reactor at Plasma Physics Lab. And this ITER, though, is going to get a huge net gain. So the gain will be much, much greater than 1, which will be exciting. And after ITER, the next step is going to be demo, which will be close to a prototype of a power plant. There's some debate whether it will be a true prototype or almost a prototype, and that's going to depend on, I think, where ITER ends up leaving us in 10 to 15 years. The picture on the right, you can see someone in hard hat. That is one of the toroidal magnets. So they're both toroidal and poloidal magnets. I'll show you them on the next page. So you see the poloidal magnets. Those are enormous. So if you look at the picture on the right, you see that there are two really big diameter magnets and some smaller ones. The smaller ones were delivered fully built, but the other ones are so big they have to be manufactured in the hall to the left. And this is an enormous experiment. I don't know if you can see how small some people around, but it's really gigantic and very impressive. They actually have a vacuum chamber, which is down to the end, where they can put the magnet in and test it. So it's completely being built on site, and that's what this entire assembly hall is. And finally, I just want to show you the ITER site, and there it is, and that shows you how big it is. And you can see it's just enormous. The reactor itself is in the middle, but there are other buildings. For example, they use ion cyclotron resonance heating, and they have a whole building devoted to generating that power and transmission lines which deliver it to the machine itself. So it's a really exciting project. We got a great discussion at the beginning from one of their experts in the overall plan for ITER and where it's going, and in the big picture of fusion in the energy world in the future. Anyway, thanks so much for listening to my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, you can always send me an email at my email address. Once again, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Palushek. That was a wonderful presentation and very exciting, the developments in fusion. We're going to have one more presentation, and we'll open it up for Q&A. So you can send questions to questions@schillerinstitute.org, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can type them into the chat. So our last speaker of this session will be Chappell Welwa. I apologize for the pronunciation. Sansvera, and he is a nuclear physicist and senior scientist at the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation, and he is the president of the African Young Generation in Nuclear. So he will be speaking to us on Africa's need for nuclear power and nuclear medicine.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of the speakers today on a very important topic of growing youth movement for nuclear power and nuclear medicine in Africa. We've seen that Africa have adopted what we call the Agenda 2063. One of the emphasis of the Agenda 2063 is the need for integration as one of the key foundations for ensuring Africa achieve its goals for inclusive and sustainable growth and development. There we've seen that within the African Agenda 2063, there are about 7 aspirations. Just to give you one of the most fundamental one, which is aspiration 2 of this Agenda 2063, placing import on the need for Africa to develop world-class infrastructure that crisscross Africa and which will improve connectivity through newer and bolder initiatives to link the continent by rail, road, sea, air, and develop regional and continental power pools, and as well as ICT. So there's a need for us, if you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Now, if you take a look at Africa, we've got about 620 million Africans who are sitting without power. So out of 1.2 billion, we can see that almost half of Africans don't have access to electricity. Therefore, Africa has not the opportunity to industrialize, to have manufacturing within the continent, which would create sustainable jobs, would improve the conditions of the Africans in order to ensure that they can move forward. There have been quite a robust debate within the continent as to what sort of technology should the continent adopt in order to ensure that it can move forward and also develop the continent for the sustainability of most of the continent population, which is young people. So when you look at the types of generations types of energy sources that we have, we know we've got some potential hydro in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which can potentially give us 40,000 megawatt of electricity. But we know what is the problem there, the geopolitical instability, regional instability that has caused the delay of this project seeing its life. So we have seen recently also, when you talk of hydro, Ethiopia have just launched or sort of commissioned a hydropower plant that is supplying most of the East African countries there. But it was not also completed without political tension within Egypt and Sudan, because they were saying that the potential of this river, as it continues to fill up, might potentially dry up some of the areas there and also affect them economically. Now, we have seen the contestation between the use of coal or hydrocarbons within the world. The world is saying that we need to move away from hydrocarbons and move to more cleaner energy that will sustain the world moving forward. But that being said, we've seen that, well, they've not been achievable because of what we've seen in terms of the energy crisis in Europe and so forth. So for Africa to develop, one of the energy sources that we could see potentially could develop Africa is the use of nuclear power. We know that in Africa, we've got 2 units at Quebec Nuclear Power Plant in South Africa that are continuously supporting South African electricity grid with almost 2,000 megawatts. But it's the only 2 power stations that are currently existing in the continent. We've seen a number of countries expressing interest within the African continent, countries like Kenya, countries like Nigeria, countries like Ghana, and so forth, who wants to introduce nuclear power due to the demand or the energy poverty that their population are subjected to. We have seen recently that Egypt have started the construction of the 4,800 megawatt of the nuclear power plants in the continent. This is very much welcome because we have seen that now nuclear is starting to expand within the continent, and this will bring much relief to the continent in terms of the energy poverty that the continent has been experiencing for decades. We know that Africa is mostly referred to as the darkest continent because of lack of access to electricity. So one of the things that we need to do, that Africa, in terms of energy, is to have a strategic plan that will ensure that its society or citizens' wellness, the skills that we develop within the continent, the energy security, which takes consideration of the environment and the competitiveness, including affordability and the funding, in order to ensure that we have got economic growth and transformation, job creation, and equitable share in terms of the African objective. Now, when you look at the nuclear power plant, it is one of the most affordable electricity. We can take cognizance that South Africa, when you look at the power generation in South Africa, in terms of the cost per kilowatt, nuclear is very, very low compared to other energy sources. The most of the developed countries in the world, they exist because of their economy is based also on the development on nuclear power. So therefore, Africa must take the lead in ensuring that they can take some of the lessons learned from the world to ensure that they also can emphasize on energy security. They can also improve the lives of their citizens by developing the nuclear power plant. So one thing is that we have over the years developed what we call established the African young generation in nuclear, which is a network of young generations within the continent in order for them to emphasize why there's a need for us to go nuclear. We have emphasized that the important aspect of this is because Africa has to develop its own capacity and ensure that, it addresses the socio-economic issues of the continent through the promotion of this nuclear power technology in Africa. So we need to do this. We've been doing it by demystifying firstly the nuclear technology, educating the public about the benefits of nuclear application. We've facilitated the knowledge transfer and skills development platforms between the current generation of leading nuclear experts, also to the young generations in terms of the nuclear profession. So what we've done is that we have offered a platform to share, exchange ideas and network on issues related to nuclear science and technology. Because what we have seen is that once we have addressed the energy issues, we have addressed a lot of things. And we strongly believe that nuclear has the capacity to address what Africa is lacking currently. And just to mention a few, we also seen that, when you develop nuclear, you've got you emphasize on developing the economy in terms of energy security, diversity, and socioeconomic development. We align it to national goals in terms of national development plans, proactively transforming and diversifying the African continent's energy mix, which opens up an opportunity or an array of opportunities within the energy sector. It gives you the benefit of industrialization and beneficiation within the South African economy, translating to a higher and inclusive growth path and job creation. Of course, this will increase the pace of inclusive growth, which will be the biggest challenges in the continent. Also bearing in mind that for sustainable economic growth, we need to develop we need a technology that can develop and advance the economic well-being of the African continent. So what we also need to take into consideration is that nuclear technology is not only power related. You can also apply it in different sectors like agriculture, sectors like medicine, nuclear medicine, and so forth. We know just from the International Atomic Energy Agency this year, there was a scientific forum which was focusing on the race of hope, which was an initiative to ensure that there can be access to cancer care. So we strongly believe that the nuclear technology can address such kind of issues. We know that the continent has been losing quite a lot of money where the population were taken out of the continent to be treated either in the East or in Europe. So therefore, we strongly believe that the development of cancer treatment within the continent through radiotherapy, through the access to nuclear medicine will ensure that, because we understand that cancer disease is one of the most killing disease in the continent. So diagnosis and treatment of cancer will ensure that the development of Africa goes forward. Just to give you an example, we've seen that now there's a therapeutic way of dealing with cancer. For an example, prostate cancer, we've seen South Africa developing the lutetium-177 production facility, which we've seen clinical trials showing that it can treat prostate cancer much better. So with that, I would like to say that thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much, and we look forward to further discussion.
Thank you to all of our speakers. And now we are going to have a discussion session, question and answer. So again, if you have questions, you can send them to questions@schillerinstitute.org. And let's see, we have Dr. Elbaz, we have Andrea Mangano, we have Jason Ross, and we have Joel Dejean, who recently ran for Congress in Houston, Texas, on the theme of nuclear power, not nuclear war. So first off, actually, I would also like to emphasize that this panel today is the second part of a conference. The first part included a discussion of this being a series of conferences, and many of the participants involved agreed that the discussion of ideas and the quality of ideas are so important right now, given the economic conditions, given the political situation, that we are going to continue these conferences. So just to keep that in mind. And we also want to encourage a real exchange of ideas, not just agreement, but just a real exchange of ideas. That's what science is about. So first off, then, I think I will take a question for Dr. Elbaz. You have spoken in other writings about the idea of an Arabian river an underground river, I believe, going from Egypt to Kuwait. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and the relationship of groundwater discoveries that you've made, possibly with what was presented in the Transaqua presentation as well, if you had any comments on that. Oh, we can't hear you.
Thank you very much. Now you can hear me?
Perfect.
Oh, we must say that at the beginning that all of the deserts of the world show indications of former rivers or former rain, former wet conditions. So the present dry conditions are just the way it is now, and maybe back to about 10,000 years ago in the geologic history. We must also know that the sand in all of the deserts is the product of running water. So meaning the sand that we see in the desert tells us that there was a lot of running water in the past, where pieces of rock are broken, they fall off the mountains, they go into the bottom of rivers, and they hit each other until you form tiny little pieces, smaller and smaller pieces, until you reach the size of the beach sand. So all of the beach sand that we see today around the continents, all of them, is the product of erosion in running water in rivers. So now when we look at the deserts of the world, we look and we see indications of these former channels. The channel that the gentleman asked about starts in Egypt. No, the channel starts in the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, in the Hijaz Mountains in the west, and it continues eastward all the way to the location of Kuwait. And actually nearly all of the surface area of the country of Kuwait was a delta of a former river, a river that was many millions of years ago. And therefore we know, because it has the blocks of rock on the surface of Kuwait, the origins of them are these mountains in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula. They could not have formed anywhere near Kuwait or Iraq or any place that closer to Kuwait today, meaning that all of these rocks have originated from the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, was brought in by running rivers, and all of these rivers dried up because of geological changes. And now we can see the flat area of Kuwait was just a delta of one of that former rivers. So the geological indications tell us what were the conditions of the past. That's why we look at the surface of the land and look at the composition of the rocks, and that's how we learn what was the past like. And that the past tells us, yes, there are deposits in the eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula that originated from the western part of the Arabian Peninsula by running water, and we can actually see the courses of the former rivers in satellite images.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Mangano, thank you for joining us. I'd just like to see if you have any comments on this question of water development in Africa, and what, if there are any developments on the Transaqua project, and if needed, what our viewers could do to help encourage the building of these projects.
In effect, the situation is quite complicated, because during the Abuja conference in 2018, the member countries of the Lake Chad Basin Commission agreed on considering Transaqua, the water transfer from the Congo Basin to the Chad Basin, as the only viable and final solution to the crisis of the area of the Lake Chad. which encompasses today more or less 50 million people. The Italian government made a pledge for financing a feasibility study of that infrastructure. Time has passed and the different countries and the Lake Chad Basin Commission didn't agree with the Italian government the practical way of rendering this money available, so that nothing has happened and the project is still at the level of an idea needing to be validated and verified. This is the situation on the, let's say, development of this idea. On the other side, the crisis in the Lake Chad Basin is going to appear every day more important and impacting the political equilibriums beside the livelihood of 50 million people. Most of the people coming across Mediterranean towards Europe is coming from those areas of the Sahel that have been affected by an increasing drought. And there is all the phenomena, we have all the phenomena of political instability and also criminal activities that are well known to our countries. At this stage, we cannot but put the attention of the international community on the fact that something has to be done to avoid that people goes away from that area in search of a better livelihood. If you don't bring water there, people will go where water is somewhere. It is a matter of life and death, or death for them. So this is something that cannot be hidden under the carpet, but has to be faced with decision.
Absolutely. So next, I think, let's see what our next question will be. I think I will take this one in general for whoever would like to take it. This might be good for Joel. Doesn't the extraterrestrial imperative of Erica and LaRouche's notion of the necessity of development of the solar system and beyond allow mankind to introduce not only higher quality, but also increased quantity of matter into the biosphere and increase mankind's access to more and higher forms of matter? This is sort of a continuation of our first panel discussion.
As far as matter, I don't know if they be particular elements, but our increased use of energy means that we can use and manipulate all of the periodic table of elements. And as a matter of fact, this might come as a shock to a lot of people, but every household that has a smoke detector has an element, americium-95, which is created in a nuclear reactor. And it creates an alpha current, which is alpha is a nuclei of a helium-4 atom. And that current is interrupted by smoke and triggers the smoke alarm. So already man has created elements. And with the mastery of the fusion torch, we can actually manipulate elements and change elements by neutron bombardment. So if you're talking about matter as far as the periodic table of elements, yes, it will increase our power over not only using elements, but creating new elements.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that? Okay, and just on the previous question that Mr. Mangano took up, thankfully that's what this forum is about, and we're going to have many people viewing this panel, but the importance of these development projects for the world is essential right now, especially as we're discussing a new monetary system. This is why we're having a panel on Vernadsky, because his economics had an approach which was not monetary and was based on a higher state of organization of the biosphere. So as we encourage this discussion, we must at the same time demand these necessary projects be implemented. And that's absolutely any part of any discussion of a new monetary system has to be included. What are you backing that system up with? Which means physical infrastructure and economic development. So our next question will be, for whoever would like to take this. When I lived in Sicily, I noticed that there were big pools of water that farmers used for watering crops. Do you think it would be feasible to construct structures to recycle water in areas where rain or snow are very common? Do these structures currently exist?
Well, I'll say something. Yes, they exist. They're called reservoirs. And to give you an example, Texas has only one natural lake. All the other dozens of lakes in Texas are man-made. So reservoirs like Lake Mead and other reservoirs behind great dams are the way that we can preserve water when it's abundant to use when it's scarce.
Excellent. Okay, our next question is on economics and a real measurement for economics. The question is, the observed indicator of GDP does not correspond to the real state of the economy. Are there such indicators, real indicators in practice? Maybe Jason would like to take this?
Yeah, so this question I think came from, I actually put this in, this came from the YouTube chat, so I'll mention who sent it in. This is from Vladimir Onoprienko, a doctor of science with the Open Noöspheric Academy in Moscow. So he was excited to hear about our conference. Yeah, GDP isn't a very good measure for several reasons. One of the issues is that it includes things that involve a flow of money, even if they're not productive. So, you know, you might say, should we include drug dealing in GDP? If prostitution is legal, should that be part of GDP? Clearly, those aren't things that actually make the economy or people's lives better. There might be some people who would disagree with me about the prostitution, but I'm going to say that. But the other major thing that's wrong with GDP is that it's absolutely terrible and incapable of understanding the value of progress. So if you think about the introduction of a totally new technology, so let's go back some time and think about the development of the steam engine. Now, you know, steam engines replaced other forms of power, for example, horse power, which is why, you know, we have the unit of a horsepower, about 750 watts. But a steam engine can do a lot of things that a horse can't. For example, I don't know what you would do with any number of horses to get a train going along at 80 miles an hour down a railroad track. That train engine would have some number of horsepower, but it's doing something that horses couldn't power. When you look at the development of this new technology then, and you want to say, how much is that worth? And you start trying to say, well, we can move things more quickly. That's worth, you know, this many dollars, and we can move larger pieces of freight easily and smoothly and so on. You can try to add up what the value is of all of these individual benefits of having a piece of infrastructure like that. But I think if we look back to what Lyndon LaRouche said in the introduction to this conference as a whole, the development of infrastructure as a platform has a value that doesn't lie in the infrastructure itself, but in what it allows in the economy as a whole. So the existence of a national rail network allows the development along the rail lines. It creates the potential for economic wealth along its entire length in a way that sea travel does not. How do you figure out the value of something like that? How do you measure the potential for development? And then to take a very clear example of, let's say, the development of electromagnetism, and now we have, electric motors, we have computers, we got computers that we're all talking to each other on right now. You could measure in terms of dollars the value of computers and what have you, but if you tried to say in terms of the GDP in the late 1800s, what the value is of these technologies, you run into the problem that GDP is a scalar. You get more or less. And you're inherently suggesting that you're measuring change with respect to the past. Whereas what's most important in those changes is the ways that it's incommensurable with the past, the ways that we're doing things we could not do in the past. So in terms of the question said, are there actual indicators of the real state of the economy? One of them, which is, I don't know if you could quite call it an indicator, it's something you have to sort of work out, but the primary one that Lyndon LaRouche used is potential relative population density. Potential population density. How many people can you support in a given area based on a certain level of technology and social advancement? So if you look at the impact of policies in terms of whether they're going to increase or decrease that potential population density, you can get a real sense of what their economic value is. So consider nuclear power, which has been a theme of discussion here on this panel. If you have nuclear fusion or nuclear fission, you've got a tremendous amount of power available with a very small amount of fuel. The amount of mining and processing that goes into creating the uranium for a nuclear power plant is orders of magnitude less than the amount of effort that goes into mining and transporting the coal used by a coal power plant, or even the amount of effort that goes into, when you consider pipelines and shipping and everything, that goes into providing natural gas to a power plant. So that intensity of power seen in nuclear allows for a higher population potential by virtue of the fact that less energy, less effort is required to provide the power that we need to power everything else in the economy. So I would say that a helpful exercise would be to try to estimate, to come up with values of potential population density, of carrying capacity at different levels of advancement in the past, and then try to take a look at a specific project, such as those discussed today with the development in Egypt, with the Transaqua project, and ask how would this transform the potential population density of an area. It's difficult to live in a desert without water.
Rachel, one metric that we've used before is the kilowatt hours per capita. And I'll just use two references. Haiti, my native country, has a 37 kilowatt hours per capita. The US has over 7,000 kilowatt hours per capita. So if you look at the living standard in Haiti and the living standard in the US, even though ours is going down, the average American has over 300 times the energy available at the flip of a switch than the average Haitian. And as in Africa, where half of the population has no electricity at all, half the population in Haiti has no electricity except for what they can use to recharge a cell phone, small solar panel, something like that. So that's another metric.
Excellent, thank you. And Joel, I know you're standing in for Mr. Palushik, who couldn't be on for the Q&A, and I know you've done work on fusion as well. Do you have any other comments on what he presented there that you would like to add or clarify?
One thing, what he mentioned is his visit to the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. That program goes back to a summit meeting between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. And it shows what can happen when leaders talk about peaceful uses of energy, nuclear power. Because that program includes all 27 European Union nations, Britain, Switzerland, Japan, South Korea, China, and Russia. And even though there are sanctions on Russians traveling, they are still allowed to travel and work on their part of the ITER. So that is an excellent example of how nations can collaborate in pushing the frontiers of real science.
I think that is in the spirit of Vernadsky.
Yes.
Take our next question is a greeting that was sent to the conference from Anastasia Makarieva, who is at the Theoretical Physics Division at the Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute. And she says, from my perspective, Vernadsky's major contribution in the field of biosphere-environment interaction was to establish that the biospheric processes are major players in shaping the Earth's habitability. Indeed, if we talk about carbon flows, for example, we now know that biological synthesis and decomposition are 4 orders of magnitude, 10,000 times, greater than volcanic emissions or other geophysical processes. So the biosphere does matter. What is the main principle of its functioning? The biotic regulation concept developed by Professor Viktor Gorshkov, whose father worked together with Vernadsky, says that natural ecosystems impose a stabilizing impact on the environment, such that our planet remains habitable due to these stabilizing feedbacks. The biotic pump on land is one manifestation of how natural ecosystems control an important flow, that of water. And the biotic pump is the idea of how forests, vegetation, and especially forests, actually through transpiration, move water so condense water in areas where it would not be without life, so that the water cycle itself is more of a product of the biosphere rather than something just standing on its own. However, big animal, this is the last question, statement. She says, however, big animals have always been disruptive in terrestrial ecosystems. By destroying vegetation, they could potentially organize an ecological and environmental catastrophe, similar to what is going on today. Humans are not unique in our ability to destroy life. So the Noösphere should be understood as a new stage of development when, due to accumulated knowledge, a global population of big animals could change its instinctive behavior and become protectors of the biosphere rather than disruptors. Good luck with the conference. So I'd just like to see if there are any comments to that.
Well, it seemed like the thrust, if I may, it seemed like the thrust of her comment is about, if I got this right, that large animals, including human beings, can disrupt natural processes in the biosphere, and that could cause some kinds of calamities. Or, I guess one thing I think about is that the actual impact of extreme weather on human beings has been decreasing dramatically and has been reduced by over an order of magnitude in the last 100 years. That is a number of people whose lives are ruined or lost due to storms, flooding, things like this. It's 10% what it was in the 1920s. And that's not because the biosphere became more benevolent, although in part it is. It's certainly not because the weather became more mild. What it is because we transformed our relationship to nature. We developed ways of increasing our independence from the sort of built-in state of nature around us and interact not with that environment, but with the synthetic environment of our creation. So we do this with things like irrigation. We do this with flood control. We do this by having electricity and buildings and air conditioning and heating and communication systems so we can get out of harm's way if there's a hurricane on the way. We do this with better buildings that are less susceptible to damage in an earthquake. We do this through cold storage and refrigeration for food products so that they're not lost due to being spoiled, as so much of the agricultural produce of the world unfortunately is today. We do this by developing synthetic fertilizers, so we're not reliant on, bird poop or cow dung. We can create our own nitrogenous compounds. So in doing all of this, we do what the biosphere was doing before our emergence, and that is developing a higher flow of energy and developing an increasing self-reliance by making internal environments that are productive, like the warm-bloodedness of mammals allows for chemical processes that require a certain temperature range or enzymes or what have you. They're able to occur when you've got a self-regulated temperature. You can't do that in a reptile. So I think that's one of the most important things to keep in mind with all of this, is that we're not simply at the mercy of the biosphere, although keeping it in good shape is of course important, but the most important determinant of our susceptibility to disasters or catastrophes of this kind is our level of development. And if we shut down development out of concern that we have to prevent a climate catastrophe, then we are generating a human catastrophe by continuing poverty, which is the greatest threat to life.
Great, thank you. Our next question is for Mr. Mangano. In your organizing for Transaqua, to what extent are environmental concerns brought up in opposition to it? For example, is there opposition to the transfer of water between different basins overall? Do you know where such opposition comes from? And do you have any advice to those who are worried that building Transaqua would upset a natural balance? And secondly, there's another question. How do you answer critics who say that Transaqua will subtract water from Congo, which Congo needs to produce electricity at Inga? And do you think that some external agencies are suggesting such arguments to sabotage Transaqua? Oh, can't hear you. We can't. Yep. Nope, not yet.
You hear me?
Perfect.
Hello?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, very good question. In effect, Transaqua is just at this stage an idea that needs to be explored and verified. That's why we are asking the international community since several years to finance a feasibility study of this idea, to check whether it is feasible on technical grounds and what would be the impacts on environment and human life. Of course, we do believe that these impacts are compatible with the development of an enormous area of Central Africa, but we are not, We have no prejudice on this. We simply say this is an idea, a potential solution to a dramatic crisis in a large portion of Africa. We have to study it and verify it. If you don't study, if you don't carry the investigations that are needed to ascertain the consequences in terms of environmental impact, social development, and so on, you will never be able to give an answer to such question. As far as the hydropower potential of Inga is concerned, I fully understand the worries of the experts from Congo, but this is absolutely not a problem in technical terms. It is maybe too much long to explain why. I will try to resume the reason for. The discharge of the River Congo at the mouth is about 42,000 cubic meters per second, which is an enormous quantity of water. Inga is almost at the mouth of the Congo River basin, so we can assume that this is the average discharge that could be exploited for hydropower production in Inga. But this is an average. Now, no hydropower station is designed to cope with the average discharge of the river. It's a nonsense. It is designed to exploit a portion of the river discharge, economically rentable. If you not 100%, of course, of the maximum discharge can be exploited, because this would require an enormous investment in turbines for a production limited to a few days in the year. So the dimensioning of the hydropower station is a matter of technical and economical consideration. If you build a series of dams upstream on the tributaries of the Congo River, you certainly, and take some of this water out from the Congo River basin towards, and you discharge towards the Chad basin, you are in the meantime regulating the discharge of the Congo River, thus rendering it more constant during the year, and thus permitting to increase the potential production at Inga, not to decrease it. So if properly designed, Transaqua would help increasing the potential hydropower protection at Inga and not decreasing it.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is from Ivan Katsanda, a television newscaster based in South Africa. I think Mr. Sansvera is no longer with us, but we'll see if someone would like to answer this. With 17% of the world's population, Africa's total contribution to greenhouse gases, the main culprit for what they call climate change, is just around 3%. How can the Western world, or anyone for that matter, demand that African nations leave fossil fuels when it was these same resources that powered economic development everywhere else? Is there an agenda to slow down economic development on the continent? That's for anyone that would like to answer.
I'll jump in. I'll say yes. Yes, there's an agenda to slow economic development, not only on the African continent but worldwide. And the very idea of trying to so here's the way it ends up working, is that African nations are told that it's now known that CO2 is extremely devastating, therefore you have to develop in low carbon ways, as it said, and therefore no loans will be made for, let's say, a coal power plant. Now, there is plenty of natural gas and across the African continent, which is a good thing, but to reject the construction of power plants in an area of areas of extreme energy poverty is a policy of saying that you don't care if people die in poverty so long as some carbon goal is met. Let's not forget, the whole idea is that we're trying to have a better world for the future of people, right? I mean, if there's some planet around some, star out there that nobody's on, that there's no sentient life on, we're not worried about some other planet out there. We're worried about this one because we live here. We want to have a good future for ourselves, for the next generations. And the creation of the modern environmentalist movement was largely a product or a project by such wonderfully democratic-minded people as European royalty, who essentially wanted to have a world population of 1 billion or less. And one of the ways that they would do that is to say, what can we do to prevent development? So there's financial ways of doing that, like debt traps, what China is now accused of engaging in. This is what the IMF and the World Bank had done for some time. Financial assistance, loans, etc., creating a large amount of debt, but not a level of development that is required. So, I think with the COP27 conference, with the failure of the last COP conference through nations such as India, Russia, China, either committing to goals that are quite far off or simply refusing to commit in a serious way to anything, this is a change in the state of the world at present, where the ability for the UK, the US to dictate policy is coming to an end. And one of the areas that that's taking place in is this climate stuff. So, anti-carbon groups are funded, NGOs are funded in nations in Africa, around the world, overall, as an effort to prevent the kind of development that would make it possible to have strong sovereign nations with growing populations that are harder to take advantage of. So I think this enormous disparity between the population of the continent of Africa and contributions to what are called greenhouse gases from nations on the African continent is enormous, and it's the most extreme hypocrisy to demand reductions in an area that produces so little. And yes, the reason for this is an agenda. It's a new form of colonialism, essentially. That's my take.
We will just take a couple more questions before we head into our last speaker. This one is for Joel. We are looking at the development of technologies for connecting and developing tunnels just below the lunar surface for industrial research and habitation facilities. One potential system would be a modified tunnel boring machine. Having a lot of electricity from lunar sources would be quite an advantage. What size package could be envisioned for a stationary 1 to 5 megawatt generating station on the lunar surface, using various potential from the fusion power systems indicated? Could these be made small enough for delivery from the Earth, or is it practicable to convert a thrust system to a power system?
Yes, you can convert that direct fusion drive to a power system. And I don't know if the pictures that Michael showed the dimensions of a 1 megawatt reactor is about the size of a refrigerator, and all the controls would fit inside a small minivan. So think of a minivan with 1 megawatts of power available for years. And as far as boring tunnels, I think Elon Musk has a company that he calls Boring. The only problem is he couldn't get any engineers to stick around because the job was too boring.
Okay, thank you. This is for Mr. Mangano. Jerry Halloran asks, the Congo River has a depth over 1,000 feet. How about Lake Chad? He says, build the Cairo Cape rail development system to move life into the future.
No, I didn't understand the question, sorry.
He's asking, what's the depth of Lake Chad?
The depth of Lake Chad is a few meters. It's a very shallow lake. Its surface area greatly varies with climate fluctuations, with rainfall fluctuations. But this is, let's say, Lake Chad is a sort of evaporating tank capable of compensating the rainfall with evaporation. If you increase the amount of water consumed by human beings, or if you decrease the rainfall incoming into the basin, the lake is going to shrink. Otherwise, it goes to increase. So it is a very direct and simple indicator of the equilibrium between offer and demand of water within the basin. It is an indicator of the equilibrium between the demand for water and the availability of resource. Our idea is not that of saving Lake Chad. This could be a secondary outcome, let's say, of the Transaqua idea, or the water transfer idea. The main purpose of this project would be that of bringing to an enormous and very fertile part of Central Africa the possibility of the developing irrigated agriculture, livestock, industry, and so on. The amount of water that is going to be diverted from Congo to Lake Chad is exactly one of the items to be, let's say, to be identified by the feasibility study that we claim has to be carried out.
Very good, thank you.
If I may add a very short consideration, the idea of the water transfer is such that we think that it can develop by steps according to the increase of demand and to the evolution of the climate change phenomenon. So it would be quite flexible, quite a flexible project, capable of being developed in the next decades according to the evolution of demography on one side and climate change on the other.
Very good, thank you. I will, at this point, just ask if we have any comments from any of the panelists, just in general to the discussion we've had so far. I think we will be wrapping up this section.
One comment is if people should go back and listen to the Italian professor we had the last panel, because the truth of the matter is CO2 has nothing to do with climate change. And as the professor said, the most powerful greenhouse gas is H2O, water. So unless we're going to ban water vapor, there's no chance that anything anyone does limiting hydrocarbons or attempting to cut CO2 output is an imbecilic gesture. The whole greenhouse effect comes from water vapor, not methane, not CO2. And the climate is much more complex than just limiting output of some greenhouse gas. So the whole intent of the man-made climate change hoax is to kill people. And as far as limiting the GDP or the economic output of Africa, yeah, that's part of it, but they want to eliminate 90% of Africans. Prince Philip and King Charles have the stated goal that they want to reduce mankind's population to less than 1 billion people. And you can't do that with just wars unless you go nuclear. So the most effective way they've come up with is to get people to commit suicide by limiting their energy use. And that's what we have to go after.
Thank you. Mr. Mangano, do you have any further comments you'd like to add? If you can hear. Mr. Mangano, can you hear? Would you like to add any
Yes.
further comments? Okay.
No, not so far.
Okay. Jason, would you like to add any other?
Well, I guess I could. I'm certainly eager to hear from Professor Pollack soon. I feel like I've pretty said most everything I wanted to say during the first panel, to be honest. So I've got some questions for after we hear our next speaker, but.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, our next speaker will be coming up. He was at a previous engagement, so he won't be able to get on until about 4 p.m. Eastern time. So we'll just start back up, but then we'll take a short break. Our next speaker will be Professor Pollack from the University of Washington. So he'll be speaking on water, the relationship of easy water and life. So, yep, just stay tuned and we'll be back at 4 p.m. Are we starting? Well, let's make, oh, we're on? Okay, welcome back from our short break. Our last speaker today will be Professor Pollock, from the Professor of Bioengineering at the University of Washington and founder of the annual conference on physics, chemistry, and biology of water. He will be speaking to us on the fourth phase of water and life. We already heard a very interesting presentation on water and life from Professor Boykov earlier. So this should be a very interesting extension of that discussion. And as we know, Vernadsky spoke a lot about water and its relationship to the biosphere. And he wrote a book, The History of Natural Waters, and identified 530 species of natural waters, sort of viewing waters as a type of mineral. And he said, water without life is unknown in the biosphere. So with that, I would like to welcome Professor Pollock.
Oh, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Are my slides visible now?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I want to talk about a fourth phase of water, and a surprising role of light in this fourth phase of water. And of course, we know by now about Vladimir Vernadsky. I know that Vladimir Boykov has presented, and I don't know if it appeared, but I read that he is on one of the Ukrainian banknotes shown here. And of course, he was he talked about the central role of water in all biological matter, and so his work is absolutely compelling and really important. And I would like in my presentation to go on and deal with indeed the role of water in biology, in the biosphere. Continuing on the work of Vernadsky. So one of the questions is, how much do we really understand about water? It's been studied for more than 100 years or 200 years. It's so central to, as Vernadsky talked about, so central to everything that occurs in the biosphere. Do we really understand it? Here's an example. Clouds. The cloud floats above the water. Why does a cloud float above the water? The cloud consists of water mostly, but we know that if we were to climb all the way up with a pail of water and turn the pail upside down, the water would come crashing down like a waterfall. How come the cloud doesn't do that? Another example, and by the way, if you don't know the answer to that, you really don't know all of water. Take two beakers filled with water, brim to brim, stick one electrode in one electrode in the other, impose a high voltage, and here's what happens. It forms a bridge. And if you move one beaker away from the other mechanically through a stage, you can see that the bridge persists, and it persists up to distances of 3 or 4 centimeters and essentially indefinitely. If you don't know how this works, the explanation, you don't understand all there is to know about water. Now, another example, this is a lizard that mostly sits in Central America. I think it's in Panama. Anyway, it spends its time sitting on a branch, and when it gets inspired, it jumps from the branch and it jumps into the water, and it walks on water. Because it walks on water, it's called the Jesus Christ lizard. How does it happen? What's going on there? How do you explain it? Another demonstration, the last one, this is a high power magnet, a superconducting magnet. And sitting in front of the superconducting magnet is a container of water. And the water actually contains a small amount of red dye. And the reason for the red dye in the water will be apparent in a second. So you turn on the magnet, and what happens is that the trough containing water splits into one part and the other part. It splits in such a way that Moses could walk across it, across the Red Sea. So, you know, we certainly read about it, but this is an actual demonstration from a professor at Tokyo University demonstrating that it really does happen. And it causes some consequences, like this one. If you like to do fishing, it's difficult to fish without water, but it's the way it goes anyway. I got interested in the subject of water some years ago, about 2 decades ago, from the work of Gilbert Ling. And Gilbert Ling argued that water was different. The water in the cell, or in biology, is different from liquid water, for example, water in a glass. He said that the molecules are lined up in a way. They're like dipoles. They're, you know, a dipole is like a bean with a plus at one end, minus at the other end. And he said that all of biological water consists of this special kind of water in which the molecules line up like soldiers at attention. I met him at a conference. I was just so amazed by what he had to say, and also what other people had to contribute at the conference in terms of evidence to support his point of view. So much so that I immersed myself in water, so to speak. And the first thing I did was to write this book, which is now 2 decades old. And the idea was to present in understandable fashion, because Gilbert somehow didn't quite have the, shall we say, capacity to write in ways that other people can understand. I tried to do that in this book. And it met with mixed success. Some people said, oh, it's more of Gilbert Ling, is nonsense. Everybody knows he's a crackpot. To other people who had nothing but praise to say about it. And so, but people who are really discerning people will go to it in every case, pick it up and read it. But there are some obstacles, of course. This one is reading it for a year or so before finally getting it. But anyway, it made some degree of impact, and immediately we began to study it because it seemed so critically important to study this kind of water. And starting from Gilbert Ling's ideas, we start with this. So inside the cell, there are lots of solids, mostly proteins, but other solids as well. And they have charges on their surfaces. And here you see water molecules, each one being represented by a dipole that is positive down here, negative here, to kind of line up with the charges. And Gilbert Ling argued that there are many, many of these layers that form a so-called structured water. I tried to make these ideas clear in that book. And it turns out that when we started working in the field, and I'm going to be describing that to you, we came upon some, you might say, differences from what Gilbert Ling had to say, general theme being similar, but there are really important differences. At any rate, Gilbert thought that that many of these layers, maybe even hundreds or more of water molecules, were lined up, and conventional physical chemists said, no, only maybe a couple of layers. And after that, the idea of Brownian motion or thermal motion tended to give way to disorder because of the thermal or Brownian motion. So big difference between their points of view. And we wanted to investigate experimentally what's going on. And so starting from Gilbert Ling's point of view that there should be water next to surfaces, there should be water that's lined up in a particular, molecules lined up in a particular way. And this is like a crystal where molecules are lined up in a particular way. And crystals are known to exclude solutes, contaminants and such, because otherwise they wouldn't be pure. they have to first exclude or get rid of a contaminant. So we were looking for an experimental model where we could see a region where particles or solutes can be excluded from a region, and we found it pretty quickly. This is, excuse me, this is what you might call a experimental setup. And here you see a gel, and here's the boundary of the gel sitting next to water. And the water contains some particles, little spheres, microspheres. And we looked in the microscope, and immediately we could see this zone that's right here, about 10 micrometers in size, substantial in terms of biological observations. And we thought, well, maybe this is the zone of exclusion of the solutes, and maybe this contains Gilbert-Ling-like ideas of some kind of water structure. It turns out it was more profound than this. So when we looked at the microscope and watched the video, you could see that gradually the microspheres were pushed out as though something is growing from this region and pushing out the spheres. And we began to see this again and again and again. Someone said, you got to give it a name. We called it exclusion zone because it excludes. And we were hopeful that this might actually represent the kind of water that Gilbert-Ling was talking about here. So we called it exclusion zone because it excluded particles. This region, all the particles are pushed out. They're excluded. And it works really well because easy to remember. We call it easy water. The water that is actually in this zone is a kind of water that differs from ordinary water. And we began studying this water to see if it was different from ordinary water, as we thought it might be. So in terms of the generality, though, we spent several years studying the generality. And what we found is that many hydrophilic surfaces, that is water-loving surfaces, water where if you drop a droplet on the surface would spread out. Many hydrophilic surfaces generate exclusion zones, and many of the solutes that we looked at are particles and solutes excluded from this zone. So clearly, it was really somehow different from ordinary water, because ordinary water doesn't do that. And the question, of course, that arose is this water here, the EZ water, is it really different from bulk water, from ordinary bulk water? And I don't have the time to take you through all of the evidence, but this is a summary of the evidence that exclusion zone water is physically different from bulk water. And it's a list here. I think there are eight of them or 9 of them or something. And it's all published. And this was compiled in 2011. If I were to show another slide, I'd have to add another half dozen more pieces of evidence demonstrating that the EZ water really does differ from ordinary liquid water. So this is a whole lot. For example, EZ water molecules are more constrained than liquid water molecules. And we determined that using NMR. And a lot of different properties differ from ordinary water. The molecules are more stable, negative charge. They absorb light at a certain wavelength, which ordinary water doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have time to go into all of that, but I just want to talk about this one with negative charge because it's really important. So what do I mean by this negative charge? Well, what I mean is that we have water to start with next to the hydrophilic surface, and it progressively builds EZ water here. And at the same time, it actually provides positive charge here. And when you think about it, the reason why it has to be that way is you start with water molecules from here to here. They're neutral. If you have a zone of negative charge, you must have a zone of positive charge because it has to add up to neutrality. So this region is positively charged. And the way all this happens starts with the water molecules that look like this, which occupy initially all of this space. So what happens is the water molecule, each water molecule gets broken through energy, which I'll describe in a moment. It gets broken into the negative part and the positive part. This is negative because this is charged -2 and +1, giving you -1. So these entities here gradually pile up at the interface and give rise to negative charge here. And this gets, the hydrogen gets kicked out of this space as the EZ forms and pushed into the region beyond. So we have minus and plus, which is a battery. Now, the exact structure of this battery we deduced, and it consists of a material containing, containing with water. And from the water that sits here forms sheet by sheet these easy layers. So we get the first one here, the second, the third, the fourth, and the fourth will serve as the template for the buildup of the next one, which serves as a template for the buildup of the next one, and so on and so on. And they just keep building up hugely, up to hundreds of thousands of layers under extreme conditions, up to that number. And if you look at perpendicular, look into one of these slides, the structure looks like this. It looks like hexagonal serves a honeycomb surface consisting of oxygens and hydrogens, and as you might expect, coming from water. And if you were to count the number of pluses and minuses in this water, this contributes 2 minus and 1 plus and such, and you add up around the number of oxygen and hydrogens in a total. It's not H2O anymore. It can't be H2O because H2O is neutral. And we found, I told you, we stick electrodes in here and it's negatively charged. So it's not neutral. It turns out it's actually, the unit cell is H3O2. Now, if it were H4O2, it'd be double this. It'd be neutral. Take away 1 proton, 1 hydrogen, and you're down to now H3O2 instead of H4O2, and it's negatively charged, which is what the experimental evidence dictates it must be. So this and this, you might say, is the structure layer by layer of the EZ. Now, what about inside your cells? Your cells are crowded, and this shows it doesn't really illustrate the crowdedness of what's inside the cell because it's hard to draw, but it's so much more dense in terms of crowdedness than the cartoon shows. So all of the water inside the cell is right near one of these surfaces. Actually, fewer than 10 molecules of that water lies between surfaces, actually fewer than 7. It turns out there are many estimates. So it means all of this water is right near one of these surfaces, and therefore it's negatively charged EZ water. So it means your cells are actually filled with EZ water, negatively charged EZ water. And if you were to stick an electrode inside the cell, which many people have done, you would record a negative electrical potential simply because the water contains negative charge. And those of you who are versed in cell biology will know that the prevailing view differs. Prevailing view says it has to do with the membrane, and the membrane pumps and channels are somehow giving rise to dynamics which produce negative charge in here. I think that's wrong, and I've written some things on that, but it's beyond the scope of what I want to present. And just one point: if you have a gel instead of a cell, it's pretty much the same as the inside of the cell, but has no membrane, and therefore no pumps, no channels. If you stick an electrode into the gel, you get the same result as in the cell, but no membrane, you see. So it's hard to argue that the cause of the negative potential is some membrane, are some membrane gadgets, so to speak, when a simple explanation is just because of the negative charge in the water. Now, so one question that arises, could easy water contain information? Now, why would I even touch on the issue of information? And information is because we organize each year the annual conference on the physics, chemistry, and biology of water. Each year, it's been in Germany recently. We just finished our most recent one, and I invite various people to make presentations. And one presentation has to do with the information in water. And each year, 3, 4, 2, whatever, people come and make and present using different methodologies with the same result, and that is water can contain information. Understanding how water can contain information, a good way to look at it is to look at the thumb drive. That contains information. How? How does that work? Well, if you look inside, you have a planar sheet, and sheet contains transistors made of silicon. So you have silicon here, 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 and so on. All of these silicon transistors array themselves in a uniform array, and each one of them can be addressed, and we call each one either a 0 or a 1, on, off, or what have you, and the information is contained in the array of zeros and ones that pervade this planar sheet. And the question is, well, what about in biology, in water? Is there such a sheet that maybe corresponds to what we see in a thumb drive? I think there is, because we have some nucleator, some surface, hydrophilic surface, and we have these layers that form. And again, these are oxygens and hydrogens in a very regular array, just like I showed you in the thumb drive. And also, it turns out that these oxygens sitting at the vertices do have different states, not just 2 states, the way the transistors do, but actually 5 different oxidation states. So in other words, the easy water has the 2 characteristics that are necessary to store information, and that is order and the possibility of different states. See, so this could be the kind of water that stores information. And the first one to exploit this was the late Masaru Emoto, who put intention or other kinds of energies to water and froze it and looked at the ice crystals and found something very significant. So, for example, if you took the water and played a Mozart symphony and froze it, he got some nice looking crystals. He tried playing John Lennon, Imagine, and even nicer crystals formed after he played that music. He started thinking now, putting his positive intention about thinking about peace, and he got the nice results, and also thank you. On the other hand, if he looked at derogatory remarks as this was, or playing heavy metal, he got ugly crystals. And Tokyo water, I don't have one here, was really ugly. The water that they drink in Tokyo. So he was a pioneer in that way. And some people didn't, especially scientists, did not appreciate his work. And the reason was that he would cherry pick his results, admittedly. So he'd freeze 50 Petri dishes. He'd pick out the one that best showed what he wanted to show and demonstrated it. And so very few scientists would pay attention to it because of the way that he analyzed his so-called data. More recently, other people, including renowned scientists, have dipped their toe into water. And one of them is Luc Montagnier, who won the Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, he died earlier this year. He won a Nobel Prize for his work on HIV, identifying HIV in AIDS. And when his friend Jacques Benveniste, who had worked with water memory, passed, Luc decided to take over. And what he found was astounding. So, I mean, this is genuine scientist who entered in the field. And I show here what he found. So he took 2 containers, absolutely sealed, not by little stoppers, but seriously sealed. So there was no communication no chemical communication. And in the first one, he put some DNA in an aqueous solution, something like 100 base pairs, and so a short strand of DNA. And panel 2, he put the 2 near one another, A and B, and he supplied some extraneous energy, electromagnetic, just simple neutral energy, 50 hertz, 60 hertz, something like that, put together for over a day. His hypothesis was that information is coming from the DNA or from the water surrounding the DNA and is being picked up by the pure water. To test the hypothesis, he took the pure water, he added it to the precursor material that's involved in the usual that we look out for COVID, the PCR, and amplified the DNA. And when he looked at the final result, the sequence of the new DNA matched the sequence of this original. So if he was right, and is very controversial, then information is somehow being transmitted without contact from the water or the DNA to other pure water. And it's now been repeated, demonstrated by 3 different groups, 2 Italian and one of them Chinese. That seems to be the case. So this is, you might say, real evidence for water memory by someone who is esteemed in that way. So you might think of the future where you have one of these things filled not with silicon, but filled with solid, easy water. And so are people. These robust, healthy-looking people are filled with easy water, just as Gilbert Ling was talking about, but in a somewhat updated way. And that's why they look as healthy as they do. So going back to the original question, to the answer to it, is easy water physically distinct from bulk water? And the answer is yes. I haven't gone through everyone, but a list of attributes shows that it really is different. And the structure for this easy water, 4th phase, is a layered honeycomb structure that has information storage capability. And of course, this has lots of interesting implications for the future, especially toward imprinting water toward health. Okay, next question. What charges the water battery? Every battery needs charge. This one has plus and minus separated, and your cell phone wouldn't work if you don't plug it in at night. So this needs charge too. So where does the energy come from? You can't plug it into a receptacle. How do you do that? And we found out through work done by an undergraduate student, and the answer is light or incident radiant energy. How did he find out? He was standing at his workbench studying water, and there was a lamp right nearby. He took the lamp and shined it on the chamber, doing what he was not supposed to do, parenthetically, and he saw something astounding. And it looked like this. This is real data, but this is obviously artist drawing. He took Naphion, a hydrophilic material, and next to it, he built an exclusion zone, no microspheres, and here lots of microspheres. And when he took the lamp and illuminated a region of the chamber, he saw that the illuminated region, EZ region, expanded hugely. And he invited me in, and I was astounded by what he found, because we were trying to look for the source of energy. Where does it come from? So I said, well, please take away the lamp and see what happens. And it within a period of 10, 20 minutes or so, it went back down to the original, being parallel to the hydrophilic surface, none of this expansion. So it was reversible. And of course, we wanted to find out which wavelengths of light, because light comes in different wavelengths, not just the visible wavelengths of the spectrum, but shorter wavelengths in the ultraviolet and longer wavelengths in the infrared. And we didn't know which ones. It turned out, after we did our experiments, the most effective by far was infrared. So where does infrared come from? Well, infrared comes from everything that surrounds us is generating infrared, something like this. If we were to darken the room, no light at all, you can't see anything, your cell phone picks up nothing, and you were to take a camera, an infrared camera, that images the light that's coming in, not in the visible wavelengths, like an ordinary camera, but in the infrared wavelengths, you get a beautiful image just like this, showing that practically everything in your environment is emitting infrared energy. That's the energy, that's the power that builds up the exclusion zone. So, because everything around you contains infrared energy, something happens. So there's a consequence. So you have the hydrophilic material next to water, and because the infrared energy is always there, it's going to build up a certain amount of easy water. And if you were to add more infrared energy, which you can do, you get bigger exclusion zone, bigger easy water. And if you take it away, it goes back to the extra, goes back to the original. So it means easy water is all around you. So the answer to the question of energy for buildup is the energy is powered by photonic energy, that is light. Now, we don't know that it's necessarily true that's the only source of energy, but this is at least a main one. It orders the water, and it charges the water battery. That's where the energy goes. So it's light, infrared light, that builds up all of this charge separation and order. So it means that all you need to do is lie on the beach in Hawaii, and you get recharged from the energy of the sun. The sun is providing everything. And if someone could actually figure out how the sun gets its energy, we'd be somewhere. Now, so you've got water like this that is absorbing energy from the environment, infrared energy from the environment. And what might occur to you is a question, well, can this water then do work? Because you got energy coming in, the energies should be able to power something. But I promise you that you've never seen a glass of water doing work. At least I don't think so. I'm going to show you how a glass of water can do work based on the energy that's coming in from the environment. And it all started with a Nafion tube. So, I showed you before that Nafion comes in sheets. We found out it also comes in tubes. I asked the student, undergraduate student, another one, to take a look at the tubes, put the tube in water, the Nafion tube, and see if, despite its curved surface, does it still form an exclusion zone? And the answer was it did. But I didn't have enough time. I must have been away on a trip or whatever to discuss what's the next step. But he did it on his own. He did some more experimentation. And one day, a couple of weeks later, he comes barging into my office. And the students don't usually barge in. I leave the door often ajar. If they want to come in and talk to me, I want to make sure the door is open. But he came really barging in, and I was in the middle of a chat with an important scientist, but I got to admit, it was not so interesting. And when the student came in, I half appreciated that he was interrupting me. So he said, I just found something and I thought I had to share it with you because it's interesting. He said, the water keeps running through the tube without stopping. I thought, if he's right, this is more than just interesting. And we confirmed very quickly that he was right. That is, you need energy to drive the flow because the water has viscosity, and in order to push the viscous water through, you need energy. It's kind of like your cardiovascular system. You need ventricular pressure to drive the flow through your large vessels, right? And so it to me, it said, we just found we just found that infrared energy is absorbed from the environment into the water. That seems to be the only measure of energy coming in that we can think of that would repel the flow. And I think that was correct. And so the way it looks is this: you take a tube full of water and you fill it immediately, make sure there are no air bubbles, and immerse it into water plus microspheres, take it to the microscope and look at to see what happens. And what happens looks like this. Whoops. No, sorry, that was, it looks like this. So here's Naphion, exclusion zone, and the water with the microspheres, you can see the water runs right through the tube. And we had it going, we had to keep going up to a day and a half, and we know how to make it grow even longer. So some people came and said, well, you know, it's interesting that you saw this thing in a tube of Naphion. Maybe there's something special about Naphion. Why don't you try some other tube? And so we tried to find other tubes, and we found the best solution was to start with a gel and make a tube. So it looks something like this. And the idea is you start with a polyacrylic acid gel, and you put a wire inside as it's gelling. And after it's just about gelled, you pull the wire out, and it turns out that you have a tunnel inside the gel, inside the chunk of gel. And when you immerse this chunk of gel into water and microspheres, the EZ begins growing here and begins growing here, pushing all the microspheres to the center into a core. And if you watch the video, it does precisely the same as I showed you with the Naphion. So this is a general phenomenon. We have now at least 7 or 8 different examples. In every case, the water, which contains the microsphere markers, is flowing through. And somebody, so it's not just something special to Naphion. And someone said, well, if you think this is powered by infrared energy, why don't you just supply more infrared energy and see if it goes faster? And we did that, and we published it. It turns out you put more microsphere light, microsphere illumination in, and we could get up to a 5 times increase of flow. So really, infrared energy is powering this process. So essentially, we have a hollow tube immersed in water, and water is flowing right through it. It keeps flowing without stopping. So work is done, right, as I mentioned before, and therefore energy is required. And the only source of energy that we can think of still to this day, unless someone can identify another one, is the energy absorption that occurs when infrared light is incident, and it's just all over the place. So the energy absorption is a necessary condition, and therefore water, what it's doing by virtue of this infrared energy is transducing this energy, light, into mechanical energy. So what's going on here, in the right kind of geometry, is infrared is giving energy, and the result is flow. And of course, this has a lot of implications in terms of plants and animals, because it's so simple. It's just a tube and infrared energy, and you get flow. So the question that will arise to you is, do we make use of this radiant energy of light? Now, we think we don't, because plants do it. Some unicellular organisms do it, but it's thought that we don't do it, that we don't use any kind of light energy at all. But you think about Mother Nature, when she's successfully come forth with energy for plants and energy for single-celled organisms involving light. And if Mother Nature is as clever as we attribute to her, she might say, well, since I'm about to create animals, they can forage, they can get food, but, why throw away this wonderful mechanism that exists using light? If I'm inventing animals, maybe I should keep this mechanism in reserve for the animals. And so, you know, it's possible that nature actually has done that for us, and with most of us not realizing, in fact, that we can use this kind of energy. So we have infrared energy that's coming in to us, and many of the wavelengths can penetrate through the body. And one idea is that maybe our cardiovascular system, which involves flow, makes use of that energy. See, and so we thought this is a possibility. We didn't think it at first, but it came from a Russian scientist. I went to the laboratory. It was actually the laboratory of Vladimir Vaikov, who presented earlier. And he introduced me to someone who works in a neighboring laboratory. And this guy was telling me there's a big problem in the cardiovascular system. And I said, what do you mean, big problem? I had my nose up in the air because I'd started my graduate school education, writing a dissertation on flows and pressures in the cardiovascular system. And I thought, well, you know, I know what there is to know. What kind of big problem is this guy going to be talking about? Well, he had me convinced in 5 minutes that there was a big problem, contrary to what I had thought. And what's the big problem? The big problem is that the capillaries, the size of the capillaries is down to 3 or 4 micrometers. And the red blood cells that need to pass through these narrow capillaries are twice the diameter, 6 or 7 micrometers. So, you know, it's kind of, has nature made a mistake or something like this? It's kind of like what happens in your toilet. Sometimes the toilet gets stuffed and, you know, you need to take the plunger and use your energy to plunge to make sure it's cleared. The situation is analogous, right? It takes energy. So these guys calculated how much energy would be required. And of course, you never know with calculations, but they may give an order of magnitude. And what they calculated is that if the energy came from the pressure developed by cardiac contraction, ventricular contraction, the amount of pressure that would need to be developed to push those red cells through is something on the order of 1 million times the actual pressure that is developed, which means, you know, obviously, even if they're off by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, there's no way. There has to be something else that's helping to propel the blood through the cardiovascular system, because there just isn't the amount of energy. So you can look at this, you can look at red blood cells. It should look like this, but when they're in capillaries and flowing, they're bent. You can see in order to get through, they're bent, and this one is having real difficulty. So this is muscle tissue, by the way. You can see the striations, and they run through. This guy's having real problems with it. This one's a little slower, and so on. But the amount of energy that's needed to do what you see here is astronomical. And it can't simply come from cardiac contraction. It must be something else. And indeed, people have published papers, a half dozen of them, over the past 100 years or so, demonstrating that when the heart stops, the flow doesn't stop. Something else is driving the flow over and above the heart. And so we raised the question. In our laboratory, we saw you take a hollow tube, put it in water, and radiant energy builds easy, which drives slow. Question is, does the same thing maybe apply in our cardiovascular system, which is what we started thinking about? Might radiant energy help drive blood flow? So we did the experiment, and the student who did the experiment using a chick embryo, 3 days old, told me when I suggested this project to him, he said he thought I was on some kind of drug because there's no way that this could happen. But he found that there was a way indeed. So he did the experiment. He took a chick embryo, 3 days old. The regulatory system is not well developed, neither the neural or hormonal system. So it's a pretty pure sample. And he was able to focus either on this vessel or on this vessel. So step one is to inject in the heart potassium chloride. It stops the heart cold. And here's what happened. So this is blood velocity versus time. Immediately at time 0, he injects into the heart stops. And when the heart stops, the flow goes way down to some low value. And by the way, it goes to a low value, well, in part because the heart is not pumping anymore, but because the heart becomes an obstacle then. It's an obstacle to flow. If something else is controlling the flow, it's got to go through the heart, and the heart is not doing anything. It's just a blob that, and so you get a particularly low flow. But at any rate, it's not zero. It just keeps flowing. And the test was to see if the signature feature of this mechanism, which is infrared energy driving the flow, whether it applies. And you can see the infrared is turned on here, and the flow increases to roughly 3 times the initial size. And then you take it away and it goes back to the control value. So it looks as though your cardiovascular system, and maybe even mine, is powered not completely by the ventricular pressure that develops, but also by a mechanism that is embedded directly into the blood vessels and contributes to the flow. We don't know what fraction of the flow in your blood vessels comes from the action of the heart and what fraction comes from the vessels. And that remains to be sought out. We simply don't know. So, I mean, basically, we found that radiant energy does help drive blood flow. And it doesn't mean necessarily that we photosynthesize, but it does mean we use step 1 in photosynthesis. If you remember the process, step 1 is the light coming from outside being split by a chromophore into positive and negative components. That's pretty much the same as what I've been demonstrating to you. So what I've been demonstrating to you may be very closely related, if not the same, as the first step in photosynthesis, splitting the water into 2. Like that doesn't mean that we photosynthesize, but it does mean that we use light in a similar way to plants and some unicellular organisms. Light supplies the energy. So then how does light facilitate function exactly? I showed you one mechanism in the bloodstream, but it does it actually rather generally. So here we have the cell, and we have proteins inside the cell. And the water is mostly interfacial, easy water because it sits right next to these hydrophilic surfaces. Water practically fills the cell. So if you think about it, the cell is filled with negatively charged water. These charges want to repel one another because they're right nearby. They're all the same charge and they repel. And that constitutes potential energy because the negative charges are close to one another, and all they want to do is get away from one another. That's potential energy. And that's what leads to protein folding, this potential energy driving the proteins actually to fold and then return back to their initial state. And that's described in detail in this book. And the way you might think about it, the way this kind of energy drives the protein folding, it looks something like this. If you look at the left side, you can see a protein in its extended state with surrounding easy water. Think of it, say, as a secretory cell, or maybe a muscle cell is even better. So the proteins are in this shape. When the muscle contracts, what happens is the water melts into ordinary liquid water and the protein folds. And then when the contraction is over, or the secretory action is over, or whatever, the particular cell, and then it's pumped back to its original high potential energy state, ready to go the next time. So it's like a cycle. Now, the cycle depends on the presence of easy water around there. If you have a cell no EZ, or it's not realistic, I mean, with deficient EZ, let's say, then the cell tries to undergo the same sort of process, but it can't do it because the EZ water isn't there. So the cell is impotent. It means it's not functioning. The cell is dysfunctional if it doesn't have the EZ water. So the idea is to build up EZ water. And the energy, the potential energy to drive the work of the cell looks like this. So light builds EZ water, which has negative charge here, which contains potential energy. And the energy drives the work and folding of the proteins inside the cell. That's what creates the action. And if you connect the dots, light gives you work or folding. So when you ask, where do we get our energy? Sure, we get some energy from food, but I argue that we also get energy from light. The light is infrared light, is absorbed by water. It builds EZ and therefore builds potential energy. And an example of someone who doesn't eat, actually no food, no water, this guy Prahlad Jani from India claims 65 years of no drinking, no eating. No drinking should be clear because where he lives in India and near Ahmedabad, it's very humid. So it's filled with moisture, but no food. And he was told, he claims, he was told that all he had to do was meditate and pray, and he didn't need to eat anything. So he lived in the jungle in his cave. He claims to have prayed, meditated, and have eaten no water for 65 years. So he reported himself to the government in India. They did some tests. They found nothing. And then he was subjected to tests by a group of medical people, put in the hospital in a sealed room for, it was either 10 days or 2 weeks, and they assembled every ologist you could think of, a pulmonologist, a psychologist, a cardiologist, all the ologists put together, and they could find nothing unusual about this guy. He was perfectly normal, but he didn't eat anything. And there are many, many such people, I know some of them, who go on to live their life without eating. They need to drink, but no eating. And so if you think about how these people get their energy, the breatharians, they certainly don't get it from food, but they can get it from light. And the light energy is absorbed by the water, builds EZ, builds energy. And so, for building energy for yourselves, to create function, what should matter to you? Well, light matters more than you think, okay, and water matters. And so for simple expedience, and I'm coming near the end, I'm sorry, I'm running on a bit. What matters is, so what builds EZ water in your cells? Because that's what you need to function properly. And I'm going to list 6 items. One is just water. It's the raw material for building EZ water. So you got to keep yourself hydrated. This is hydration, effectively, filling your cells with EZ water. And the raw material is what you need. It converts some of the water that you drink into EZ water. Another one is green juicing. So you go to your backyard and you pull the leaves of freshly grown plants and you macerate them so that you squeeze out the water and not get filled up by eating, drinking, but just taking the water. And the water is just filled with EZ because those plant cells themselves are filled with, they're fresh, robust plants that are just filled with EZ water. So you drink the EZ water directly from the plants. And people I know who have suggested this to their patients uniformly report huge successes after drinking this for a few months. An easy expedient. Certain substances are known to promote health. And there's been a lot of talk, for example, about turmeric as being one, and also basil, and so on, coconut water, et cetera. We tested these. And the hypothesis was that the reason they're all good for health, the reason is that they all build EZ water. And we tested this in experiments that we published, and we found that at biological concentrations, I think I need some turmeric. In biological concentrations, each and every one of these builds easy water. So possibility that the health impact of all of these, known since Ayurvedic ages, arises from because these substances build easy water. That is the reason for it. And in fact, we did the opposite. We tried a poison. We tried glyphosate, which is the main ingredient in Roundup. That's a weed killer. It's a poison. And we found at every concentration we tried a diminution of the amount of easy water. We haven't tried other poisons yet, but it could be that one of the main mechanisms by which these poisons work is to eliminate the easy water, eliminate the hydration. That's yet to be determined. Sunshine, where I live in the Northwest. Today it's sunny, but usually at this time of year it's gray and gloomy. And when the sunshine comes out, people have smiles on their faces. And, it may be a purely psychological effect. However, there's another possibility. When the sun comes out, the sun contains, about 50% of the sun's energy is visible wavelengths, and half of it is infrared wavelengths. So when the sun comes out, you're receiving a lot of infrared. And the infrared is absorbed, actually, evidence shows it's absorbed through the skull, and then it can come out again in terms of creating an image of your brain. And so when the sun comes out, you got the energy that's coming in, building easy water. So that could be why you feel better, because in your brain cells and your nerve cells, you're building easy water. And as you build it, the cells begin to work as they should work normally, the default case, and that is feeling good, not feeling depressed or anything. And an extreme example of this is the sauna, or as they say in Finnish, sauna. What is that? Well, it's an extreme version of the sunshine. It's heat, right? You get in and you're bombarded with huge amount of infrared energy. The infrared energy penetrates your body, builds EZ, and builds yourself back to health. So if you got a headache or if you got muscle action, you go into the sauna, and after 20 or 30 minutes you're out, you're feeling better. And finally, grounding. So what is grounding all about? Well, it turns out that the earth bears negative charge. And I didn't know about this. I began my studies in electrical engineering, and no professor ever told me that when you plug in the plug into a receptacle, that third prong is getting plugged into not neutrality, but a vast sea of negative charge. When a Russian colleague told me that was the case, I told him, you're crazy. I never heard such a thing. And then next morning, one of my students brings me the lectures of the great physicist Richard Feynman, demonstrating indeed that that's the case, demonstrating evidence collected over the past 30, 40 years, plenty of evidence that the earth bears negative charge. So what happens if you connect yourself electrically to negative charge? We found in the laboratory, if we take a wire and stick it in the water and pass negative charge through the wire into the water, that negative charge, the electrons, convert ordinary liquid water into EZ water. They get the negative charge, and the conversion occurs. And so the same thing probably happens when you connect yourself to the earth. You get negative charge. The negative charge builds EZ water in your body, and wherever you may have a deficiency of negative charge, you grow more negative charge and come back to health. And that's why there are many people who are now using the grounding or earthing to improve their health. It seems to work very well, and I think the mechanism is as simple as what I just told you. It's building EZ water inside your body. So beyond the health, just last couple slides, practical applications. The first is getting energy from from water and sunlight. So you've seen this diagram enough times. This is like a battery, and if you were to connect electrodes, you should be able to light a light source, and indeed you can. So here's a video that shows it. These are little chambers containing naphthalene and 2 electrodes and water. One electrode is in the positive, one electrode is in the negative, and it repeats a dozen times or so to build up the amount of energy. This is a switch, and here behind the magnifier is a light-emitting diode, LED. And so now all this is basically water plus infrared energy, sunlight, other kinds of infrared energy. And you turn the switch, and there you go. You can light the light. So it means that what you can do with this is you can produce electrical energy from water and sunlight. And you can imagine that built to scale, this has the potential, we don't know for sure, to lead to something practical in terms of generating electricity simply from water as the transducer and the impact of sunlight, which comes free. Another one is getting, what do I have here? I can't read it. Drinking water from contaminated water. Okay, so and the way that this works, we call this a filterless filter because it has no filter. There's no physical filter involved, nothing to replace or clean or whatever. And it starts with a naphthalene tube or any kind of hydrophilic tube. So the flow comes in. The water flow, the water will contain all kinds of contaminants, and the contaminants quickly get separated, get pushed away from the naphthalene surface. You have an exclusion zone here and here, and all the contaminants get pushed to the center. And then we devise this differential extractor, which takes the junk, the contaminants at the center, collects them, and dumps them. You can see here the representative junk. In this case, it's microspheres, but we've used other representative junk concentrated here. And here at the edge is the exclusion zone, which has excluded all of this stuff. And you collect that. And this is actually EZ water, which is good for health. And you can see it here. And we've been able to separate up to 200 to 1 in concentration in the laboratory, and we've actually developed this to a fair extent. We have a ways to go before we can get it to actually work, but this has the capacity to act as a filter to get rid of all the ocean, for example, contamination with no energy except energy from the sun. That's all. And finally, salt. So think about this. We know we can separate salt from water. So you take ocean water and plug it in, and all the salt accumulates here. And this region here and here, these regions are salt-free. Drinking water, good drinking water, because they contain EZ water. So this is a prospect for the future. We can imagine with some development, and we basically need the resources in order to proceed with the development. It's possible that it may be possible to take ocean water and out of the ocean water get drinking water out of that. And imagine what a boon that would be. So we reach a conclusion. The work of Vernadsky, he was able to see the future in a way that he's not really given credit for, except maybe his appearance on the banknote, an Ukrainian banknote. But he was essential, and in terms of the ideas that he was able to bring forth, which Vladimir originally discussed earlier in an earlier segment. And essentially what we found is that the water contains not only 3 phases, that is ice, liquid water, and vapor, but a 4th phase. And the 4th phase I put right here in between the ice and the water, because the structure, in fact, is not so different from ice. It's not ice, but it's not so different. And it turns out our experiments have shown that if you want to freeze the water, you can't go directly from water to ice. You go from water to EZ and then to ice. And if you want to melt the ice, you go from ice to EZ to water. And I don't have time to show the evidence for it, but it turns out, and now the idea of going through this intermediate phase, it resolves so many of the energetic considerations that have been mysterious in the past. And this has broad implications. So the main implication is that water receives all the time, it keeps receiving infrared energy, radiant energy, mostly at infrared wavelengths. And in terms of biology, I demonstrated to you that this energy could actually get used in propelling your blood in your cardiovascular system, and probably a whole lot more inside your body. In terms of chemistry in general, well, you've read the same chemistry books that I've read. You sometimes have to scratch your head in terms of interpretation. However, interpreting the results of aqueous solutions, there is not one attempt, at least that I've seen so far, to incorporate the role of infrared energy, charge separation, buildup of EZ, or any of this stuff. And so if what I presented to you has some scientific merit, it may be that many aqueous solutions, many of the interpretations about what goes on, they could be much different from what you currently receive and learn in the chemistry books, and hopefully more straightforward. In terms of weather, clouds are full of electrical charge. Of course, you can see evidence for that during thunderstorms, lightning storms, but there's more, and evidence, direct evidence from 50, 60 years ago shows that all clouds are charged, not just the particular clouds from which you can see discharges. And I have yet to hear any forecast by any atmospheric scientist who mentions the word electrical charge yet. I think electrical charge is absolutely central in everything that happens in weather. And if we're ever to understand seriously about climate change and such, it's necessary to know about weather. And so my next book, which is coming soon, is going to be talking about weather and the role of electrical charge, and hopefully we'll know whether to leave our raincoats home as we go off to work or not. In terms of health, well, we all need to be hydrated, and there's really nothing more beyond what I have to say about the role of water in health, and I've said it. And food, you want to preserve food either by freezing it or by dehydration. It's always nice to know something about these processes, and I think we now understand a lot more about these processes than we knew. In terms of filtration, I brought to you the idea of the filterless filter. We're working on this right now. It needs more fundamental work. And like the other applications that I'll just re-mention, we need the resources in order to carry out that work. And without resources, we can do nothing. In terms of desalination, it's possible. Desalination is possible today, but it involves huge amounts of energy. Usually oil energy and such. And in this case, we can, at least in theory, do desalination based on the energy from the sun. Getting electricity from water and sunlight is also another possibility that we're working on. So besides the theoretical kinds of things that you can see around here, we're also involved in the practical aspects of creating something to solve some of the problems of the world. Pretty much all of this is described in this book. It's got a pretty cover, and it's been I should say, extraordinarily popular on, for example, on Amazon. So I think I'll end here, and I apologize for taking longer than I was supposed to. If there are questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. And thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, that was exciting material, and I'm glad you're applying it in many different areas, actually.
We're trying, yeah.
So the two questions that came in that are similar on the flow in the Naflon tube. One person asks, why does the flow in the Naflon tube go one way and not the other?
That's a good question. Let me answer that one before you get to the next one. The answer is we don't know. To amplify a little bit on that, if you think of a tube, a uniform tube, with uniform infrared or light energy coming in from all over, there should be no flow, because any impetus to drive a flow in this direction should be exactly the same as in this direction. And we do find in 10 or 15% of cases, we have no flow. In other cases where, for example, suppose you set up the system next to a window, and so you have more sunlight coming through one side than coming through the other. Because you're getting more energy and more easy build up on one side than the other side, there's an asymmetry. And that asymmetry would be enough to begin moving the water out in this direction, which means replacing what had exited from the left direction. And so it keeps getting perpetuated. And that's how we think it works. But we need more evidence.
Okay, thank you. The next question says, in your book, The Fourth Phase of Water, you start with paradoxes or surprising observations, and then go into your theories only once you've posed questions that need answering. This seems different from the way classes are usually taught, where the theory comes first and then applications are made. Are there proposals you have for how to make education more fun and enlightening?
Well, I think this is more fun and enlightening that way. You pose a question and then come to the answer. And the usual way, as is suggested, is you first come up with the answer and then the questions. And I think the way of doing science, we look at observations, which can come in the form of questions, and then we're challenged to answer them. So, I mean, one example, for example, that I was talking about is the question about memory or information in water. A lot of people think that this is just complete nonsense. It's just impossible that there could be such a thing. But then we begin to see from one scientist to another, different ways of demonstrating that indeed that the water does have memory. And so we ask the question, and then we come to the question. Here's the observation. We need to explain it. That's what scientists do. We look at nature out there and we see questions that need answering, and we try to answer them. This is the way of science. In some cases, when various instructors or professors stand up and first tell you the way it is from the textbooks, and go from there, I think that's less interesting than raising the question. And I'm reminded, sometimes we as professors have a tendency to state things as though they're absolute fact, and it reminds me of Lord Kelvin. We think of degrees Kelvin. Lord Kelvin, he was a famous physical chemist. I think he was Scottish. And he was a famous guy, and he said, this was 150 years ago or something like that. He said, nothing heavier than air will ever fly. And of course, people took him seriously because he was a great scientist. And then a few years later came the Wright brothers. and so, there are many of us in science who like to profess that we really know and understand things, and we profess that they're true, but they're not necessarily true. In my own way of pursuing science, ideas that have merit usually are simple. They have a ring of truth to them. If they're complicated, it becomes raise a question. The question is an old one. It's called Occam's razor. It was Sir William of Ockham, how many, 800, 700 years ago? And he was a theologian. And he said, you know, we have the issue, does God exist? And how do you find out if God exists? He said, you have two opposing points of view. One point of view is that God exists. Another point of view is God doesn't exist. And what you need to do scientifically now is bring those two hypotheses into the limelight and ask which one is simpler. And usually the one that's simpler, whether it's God exists or God doesn't exist, is likely to be the one that is true. And then Newton came around 200 or 300 years later, and he said, you know, that's a pretty good idea. It should be applied to science. And Newton applied it, and he said science works in, quote, the shortest way possible. In other words, the simplest way possible. And the same thing, so-called Occam's razor applies. It means that if you've got two different hypotheses to explain something, one is simple, the other is complicated, it's going to be the simple one that prevails. So anyway, maybe I'm digressing from the original question or issue about most people presenting the facts. We don't always know that those are the facts. You see, this is a problem. And then you try to use those facts to explain what exists in nature. And sometimes you have to try really hard to make it fit. It doesn't always fit, but the general presumption is what's in the textbook must be right. And I can, if you like, give you examples where I think where almost everybody accepts something, but it can't be right. So, but I think maybe there are other questions, or if not,
Yeah, there's a couple more. I'll ask one, and I think we're going to have one asked via video. Someone was provoked on Prahlad Yanni and asks, leaving aside the issue of his hydration and his energy needs, what about the conservation of matter? His hair grows, his skin flakes, his fingernails grow. He has bowel movements from his intestinal lining refreshing itself. Where does this material come from to be replaced?
Okay, so I don't know the answer, but I can speculate. And I think my speculation comes from a subject called transmutation. I don't know if this is a common subject or not, but years ago, just like Newton and Occam and such, years ago, people thought that one element transmutes into the other. For example, if you have sodium, it could change into potassium. And that obviously is something that is not taken seriously today. And it was I think, the science Lavoisier, the French scientist, who had his head chopped off because he was a hated tax collector, but he was also a scientist. And he came to the conclusion that this was impossible. And since that time, everybody believed it was impossible. Before that time, and now returning to this idea, it's possible that somehow elements that you take in are converted into other elements. And there's a book by a guy named Louis Kervran, Kervran. It's called Biological Transmutation. And in the book, which is about 40 years old, Kervran was a renowned scientist, and he was appointed in a commission to figure out when there were, for example, accidents. For example, something happened inside a mine in France, and the mine blew up, big explosion, killed 50 people. What was going on? And he had to research it, and he had all the national laboratories at his disposal. He was a well-regarded well-regarded scientist. And after some years, he came to the conclusion that the only way that he could explain these disasters is if one element was actually transmuting into another. Now, this is a topic that is not, you might say, permitted to be studied, because because modern science says, well, you know, we knew since the time of Lavoisier, this is impossible. It never happened, despite the more recent evidence by Kervron. And a possibility is, if I had to place my bet on where the energy and where the elements come from, I'd put it in exactly that. So we take in, for example, we take in oxygen all the time, and we take in other substances that we breathe, and and we take in water, right? And so if we take in the water and the oxygen, one possible interpretation of what happens is that some of these undergo transmutation into the elements that we can't do without. And I don't claim any particular expertise on this, but I do claim that if you try to understand metabolism from food, it's really complicated. And whenever it's really complicated, it raises questions about, you know, how does this occur? And one, just to go on a bit longer, one thing involves what's the plant I'm thinking of? Sorry, I've been on Zoom for 4 hours today, so cellulose that grows, and it can grow by huge amounts. I'm blanking. I'm sorry. Plants that grow up a meter a day, is as much as that, and you know, there's lots of carbon, and so the question is, well, where does the carbon all come from? And some people have done calculations and said, well, you know, it's certainly not coming from the earth, because these plants are growing distinctly from the earth, and they use up whatever is there, and they just keep growing really fast. So a possibility is that they get their carbon from carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, nobody knows that for sure, but I'm just suggesting that this is one route, one avenue that could be approached to explain what these breatharians do, because they're breathing, but they're not eating. And so I'm not sure the answer to your question, but this is where I would put my nickels if I had to put my nickels somewhere.
Okay, very interesting. I think we're going to take a question from video from another panelist, Jason Ross.
Okay, hi. It's good to see you. We met in 2013 in Maryland. Not sure if you remember, but I was actually going to come to your water conference in Bulgaria and had a personal thing come up, so I wasn't able to. But anyway, I'm fan of your work.
Okay.
So, like, three things I'd want to ask about, but I'll stick with one. How do you? So, in terms of the easy water, and you'd put forward some hypotheses here about how it works, some of it in terms of already existing physical principles, also laying out some of the problems that aren't resolved yet. I wonder, I guess two things would be, how much do you see this being the need to rethink how existing principles work versus like finding actually totally new physics? And secondly, if you...
Wait. Let me answer the first one, because I'll forget. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not sure of the distinction between, you say, new physics and the other is I forget how you label it, but there can be misinterpretations. So if you build on a foundation and the foundation is not correct, you could never build anything that's simple. Everything is going to be extremely complicated. You know, so you could go back, for example, to the issue of flying on an airplane. You know, nothing heavier than air could ever fly. It was so professed, but it does. And so the question is, well, how does it work? And you can come up with very complicated kinds of interpretations or simple ones. And if it's complicated, probably is not right. And so some of the principles that we like to adhere to, which appear regularly in the physics books and the chemistry books, we build on those foundations. And well, I found that many of those foundations are not right. They simply don't fit all the evidence. They may fit some of the evidence, but you get anomalies, so to speak, observations that don't fit the evidence. But why don't they fit the evidence? Well, the reason is that your view on the foundation is maybe not right. You have to switch your interpretation and your view. So you need absolutely to start with a foundation that which you're confident is correct. And if you're building on the right foundation, a lot of things will fall into place naturally and easily. So that's how I look at it. It's the same rule, the rule of simplicity, that simplicity prevails. And if you got the right foundation, it will be simple. That's what I think. But, this is my opinion, which could be dead wrong. You have a second question? Yeah,
if we have time, Rachel, it's okay?
Yeah, I'll just say we have to be off by 5:40 at the latest. So we have time for one more question. And if you have any, including...
The one I wanted to ask, but won't, just to let you know, I wanted to ask it was about Picardy and Simon Schnoll. But let's leave that aside. I'm going to ask about, you'd written your other book about cells and gels, and what are some of the differences about how water behaves in a biological context that it doesn't in an abiotic context? Is there something different about the space or the space-time in a living cell that you simply can't recreate outside of it, do you think?
No, I think it's the same. Nature doesn't care whether it's so-called living or not living. If you have the right kind of situation, like a hydrophilic surface, then the easy water will build next to it. I'm sorry if that's a disappointing result. We all like to think that biological water is somehow different, but I don't think it's different at all. I could go on and on, but there's no reason to think that it is different. Of course, in biology, water is absolutely crucial to everything that goes on. And if you don't have it, you don't have life anymore. And that's not necessarily true of other kinds of entities. But the principles, the physics, the chemistry is the same.
I could ask a follow-up on that. My question is whether because Vernadsky talks about sort of a unique selection of life for certain isotopes and things like that there is a sort of a unique chemistry to life. I'm wondering, or maybe this has to do with the Montagnier idea, but you think that there's an idea of the structure of water with this property being organized around the principle of life, that it's connected to life inherently. And
well, yeah, it is. Without water, there's no life, and so Vernadsky was talking about that. Albert St. Georgi later, the premier the father of modern biochemistry, he said exactly the same thing, that without water, there's no life. That doesn't necessarily mean that this kind of water doesn't exist outside of life, but without it, you've got nothing. You have no life. And that's the position that I would take from all that I've learned about the subject. We don't exist in dehydrated state.
Okay, and if you wanted to ask one more, Jason, I think
if I can. So, in chapter 7 of your book, you talk about Giorgio Picardi, who had looked at how certain processes would occur at different rates throughout the day. And you also brought up Simon Schnoll, who I had the pleasure of being in touch with, who had looked at how he thought it was almost something broader about time itself changing throughout the day. I wonder do you know of research on that kind of front that's ongoing at present? Where does that stand?
No, Picardi I mean, both of these scientists are just amazing in what they've done, and they all show that there are some outside influences and processes. So, in terms of Simon Schnall, radioactivity, we think that's a random process. He showed that it's not. It has a periodicity to it, and Picardi showed the same thing in other kinds of reactions that occur, all of which, I think he used 3 of them, each one involving a different aqueous kind of suspension or solution. And he was looking at the timing of the solution very precisely. Does it take 2.3 seconds or 2.4 seconds or whatever? And he tracked this over a decade, every day, even during World War II. He kept going on. And he found there's a periodicity to these physical chemical reactions, and the periodicity had it was either 1 day periodicity, 1 month periodicity, and 1 year periodicity that he showed. So clearly, and he was controversial, but the evidence to me looked really clear. He showed that whatever these processes involve, there's some kind of energy out there that has a periodicity to it, and Schnall found pretty much the same thing for radioactive decay. There's a periodicity. It's not random, not completely random. And those observations need to be taken into account because they demonstrate that something is going on beyond what is in the textbooks. Again, another example of the material doesn't often get into textbooks. And one reason it doesn't get into textbooks is the publishers don't want to publish controversial material because they fear that controversial books won't sell. So, for example, a medical book that espouses something beyond the usual, they won't publish it because it won't sell to the medical schools who have to teach the students, because the professors don't want to teach this, strange seeming ideas. It puts a burden on them, and they simply won't do it. They'll go for the book that is more standard, and that way, what happens is that the status quo perpetuates, and we don't move on, and the textbooks remain pretty much the same as they've remained over the years, and this is a big problem.
Yeah, Rachel, I had a question.
Okay, one last quick question.
Now, have you noticed any difference between the easy structure of heavy water versus light water? I have one comment after that. So
we don't study heavy water, so I can't. I can't say what the differences would be. There is a prospect of studying, for example, tritiated water. I've been in discussion with some people in terms of Fukushima. The Japanese now, they have some cisterns that they have filled with radioactive water, and the plan is to dump them into the ocean. A lot of people think this is a really bad idea to dump this water into the ocean, and they want to look at the mechanisms by which you can maybe separate out the tritiated water that exists from the ordinary water. And we're under discussion now about possibility that if easy water, we don't know about easy water. It could be that tritiated water, heavy water, forms easy just the same way as ordinary liquid water, but it could also be that it doesn't. It could be that the tritiated water is in fact excluded. We don't know what's the case, but this is an example, one possibility. It's purely speculative because we have no concrete evidence to answer the question that you asked. I'm sorry.
Okay, one comment. That general relativity is far more complex than action at a distance. It has been proven to be more truthful than Newton's concept of gravity.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Well, the point is the simplest is not always the truth.
Well, how do we know?
The example I use is general relativity is far more complex than the concept of gravity that we allegedly got from Newton.
How do we know it's right?
Well, we know it's right because every time we have tested it, for example, the first test was Arthur Eddington's measuring the deflection of light from a distant star during a solar eclipse. And the deflection was exactly what Einstein had predicted. So it's been proven repeatedly over the last 100 years, including gravitational waves.
Well, I can't respond to that. I have no expertise in that area, and so, you know, anything I say would be pure speculation. So I think I probably should not go any further in that. I'm just you know, I'm a skeptical guy. If something is not simple and obvious, I raise questions as to whether it's correct. And you know, I think most scientists would be in your camp and would agree with you that it's all right. And, you know, Einstein is a great scientist and pretty much whatever he said is correct. It may be, it may not be. So we'll see. But I'm no expert, so I can't speak on that subject.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have a real discussion of ideas. We don't have to know all the answers right now. So thank you for your excellent presentation and so many new and exciting ideas that I think are going to be being discussed and by many people. So
well, thank you. I appreciate your patience with me. I'm sorry I went on so long. I didn't really mean to, but I get carried away.
It's great. I do agree with Einstein that imagination is more important than knowledge. And
yeah, that's what he's famous for saying. Imagination is right, more important. Yeah, it's absolutely true. And yeah, and come to our water conference for anybody, you know, we're beyond Bulgaria. We're now moved to Germany, and we might even move again this year. It's really a fabulous conference. It's waterconf.org. Really simple for anybody interested in the subject. Okay, absolutely. Well, thank you. And appreciate your willingness to indulge my long talk. And we'll see you then. Okay.
We appreciate it. Thank you very much. And to all of our viewers, we will be continuing these conferences as discussed earlier. So stay tuned and please share widely, and we'll continue these conferences. So maybe we'll be working with you. Maybe we'll see you again in the future.
Sure. My pleasure. Okay. Thank you so much.